Excellencies, honorable delegates and colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor to address this forum today as PAM Rapporteur on Counter-Terrorism and Chair of the Policy Dialogue within the UN Coordination Mechanism for Parliamentary Assemblies on Counter-Terrorism. I wish to extend my gratitude to
Distinguished delegates, excellencies, and colleagues, I truly wish that I could be with you in Abu Dhabi today. Unfortunately, a heavy snowstorm prevented me from being able to join you in person.
Excellencies, honorable parliamentarians, dear colleagues. I'm sorry that the snowstorm prevented me from joining this panel in person, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to make this pre-recorded intervention. Full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of women in all spheres of life is strongly embedded in international law and frameworks. Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women is the second most ratified human rights convention in the world. Just last year, the international community has commemorated 25 years
Excellencies, honorable members, distinguished guests, it's a great privilege to address you at the second session of PAM Women Parliamentary Forum. I would like to warmly thank our host, the UAE Federal National Council, and in particular Her Excellency Mariam Bintaneya for the excellent organization of this important event.
عند سميحة فوق. أحمد عزت عند سميحة هنين أحمد فوق.
Excellencies, honorable members,
أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، الرجاء أخذ أماكنكم، ستبدأ الجلسة بعد قليل. Dear Excellencies, we will start very soon. Thank you so much.
Good morning. We are going to start the session. I ask everybody to take the seat, please. Yeah? Excellencies, distinguished delegate, honorable members of PAM, dear partner and guests. I'm pleased to welcome you here for the second day of this session of the Women Parliamentary Forum. Allow me to extend my sincere appreciation to all parliamentary delegation and distinguished speakers for their valuable contribution. Yesterday's discussion offered an important insight into some of the most pressing issues that women face worldwide. Today's session is held under the framework of the PAM presidency of the UN Coordination Mechanism for Parliamentary Assemblies on Counter-Terrorism. Through 2025, while holding the presidency, PAM has demonstrated sustained leadership in strengthening parliamentary cooperation and advancing effective right-based response to terrorism, violent extremism, and hate speech. PAM commitment to combating terrorism in all its forms, especially through a victim-centered and gender-sensitive approach, is reflected in the many initiatives undertaken by PAM as president of the mechanism. Notably, our Assembly participated in the Global Parliamentary Conference on Counter-Terrorism and the Prevention of Violent Extremism in Istanbul, as well as convened the first ever UN Parliamentary Training Course on legislative and policy measures to prevent and counter the use of artificial intelligence and new technologies for terrorist and violent extremism purposes. For your information, PAM is one of the main pillars now of the actions of the UN Security Council, the Directorate for Counter-Terrorism, thanks to the support of our office and think tank in San Marino. And PAM was also the first international organization which adopted unanimously a definition of terrorism.
It's okay. I listened
also
in English.
widely
Yeah,
by
but
the colleagues in the
here,
United
let's
Nations
learn
and
it.
other international organizations. Today's discussion reflects the Assembly's strong emphasis on inclusive and gender-responsive approach to counter-terrorism. Sessions 3 and 4 will highlight the indispensable role of women in preventing and countering violent extremism, as well as in addressing sexual and gender-based violence linked to terrorism. I will now open the session by welcoming our first high-level speaker for her opening remarks. I am pleased to invite here to the podium Her Excellency Honorable Miriam Binteneya, the President of the PAM Women Parliamentary Forum. Excellency, the floor is yours.
السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، الحضور الكريم، يسعدني أن أفتتح أعمال اليوم الثاني من منتدى
Excellencies, honorable members, distinguished guests.
وتتناول مناقشاتنا اليوم تأثير النزاعات والعنف وانعدام الأمن على النساء والفتيات. وتنظم جلستا اليوم في إطار رئاسة برلمان البحر الأبيض المتوسط الحالية لآلية التنسيق التابعة للأمم المتحدة بين الجمعيات البرلمانية المعنية بمكافحة الإرهاب. وإن ترأس أعمال هذه الآلية إلى جانب حوارها السياسي يحملنا مسؤولية كبيرة في مواجهة التحديات الأمنية القائمة والدعوة إلى تعزيز استجابات برلمانية شاملة ومنسقة واستشرافية وعملية. ويطيب لي في هذه المناسبة أن أتوجه بالشكر إلى سعادة الدكتورة حمدة بنت حسن السليطي نائب رئيس مجلس الشورى في دولة قطر الشقيقة على حضورها معنا اليوم. إن التزامكم سعادة الدكتورة يعكس المشاركة الفاعلة لدولة قطر ودول منطقة الخليج في التصدي لتهديد الإرهاب، بما يسهم في جعل عالمنا أكثر أمناً للجميع. كما أود أن أعرب عن شكري لسعادة السيدة ريتا تيودورو سوبرمان عضو البرلمان القبرصي التي تترأس الحوار السياسي لآلية التنسيق. ونظراً لارتباطات مؤسسية وطنية تعذر حضورها معنا اليوم، وقد أرسلت رسالة مصورة سنستمع إليها بعد قليل. والآن أعطي الكلمة لسعادة الدكتورة حمدة السليطي فلتتفضل مشكورة.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. سيرجو Is it okay? سعادة السيدة مريم ماجد بن ثنية رئيسة منتدى النساء البرلمانيات لبرلمان البحر الأبيض المتوسط، نائبة رئيس المجلس الوطني الاتحادي بدولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة، صاحبات وأصحاب السعادة، رؤساء وأعضاء البرلمانات والوفود المشاركة، الحضور الكريم، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أصالة عن نفسي ونيابة عن وفد مجلس الشورى بدولة قطر المشارك في هذا المنتدى، يسرني أن أحييكم مثمنة اهتمامكم بقضايا المرأة وحرصكم على دعم دورها البرلماني والمجتمعي. كما أتقدم بالشكر والتقدير لدولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة الشقيقة حكومة وشعبا على استضافة هذا المنتدى وما لقيناه من حسن استقبال وكرم ضيافة. وأخص بالشكر أختي الفاضلة مريم بن ثنية، وأيضا رئيس المجلس الوطني الإماراتي وأعضاء المجلس الموقرين على الدعوة وحسن التنظيم. ونهنئ برلمان البحر الأبيض المتوسط على تجديد انتخابه كآلية التنسيق لمكافحة الإرهاب بالنسبة للبرلمانيين. الإخوة والأخوات، نلتقي اليوم تأكيداً لأهمية تمكين المرأة باعتباره أحد المرتكزات الأساسية لبناء مجتمعات متماسكة وشاملة قادرة على تحقيق التنمية المستدامة والاستقرار من الخليج إلى البحر الأبيض المتوسط. فتمكين المرأة لم يعد قضية اجتماعية فحسب، بل أصبح عنصراً محورياً في دعم الاستقرار السياسي والازدهار المجتمعي والحد من أسباب النزاعات والعنف. ومما يدعو للأسف أن المرأة لا تزال تتحمل النصيب الأكبر من تبعات الحروب والنزاعات وانتشار العنف والإرهاب. وتشير إحصائيات هيئة الأمم المتحدة للمرأة إلى أن أكثر من 600 مليون امرأة وفتاة تأثرن بالنزاعات المسلحة خلال العام 2024 بزيادة ملحوظة خلال العقد الأخير. وفي هذا السياق لا يمكن إغفال ما تواجهه المرأة الفلسطينية في غزة وبقية الأراضي الفلسطينية المحتلة من معاناة إنسانية قاسية وحرمان من أبسط حقوقها. وقد أكدت المواثيق الدولية على حقوق المرأة السياسية والاقتصادية، حيث نصت المادة 7 من اتفاقية القضاء على جميع أشكال العنف والتمييز ضد المرأة على ضمان مشاركتها في الحياة السياسية. كما شددت قرارات مجلس الأمن ومنها القراران 1889 و 2122 على أهمية إشراك المرأة في عمليات السلام وصنع القرار. ومع ذلك لا يزال هناك فجوة واضحة بين هذه الالتزامات الدولية وتطبيقها الفعلي على أرض الواقع، وهو ما يتطلب منا مزيداً من الجهد والعمل المشترك. الإخوة والأخوات، وفي إطار ما يناقشه هذا المنتدى من محاور متقدمة، ولا سيما ما يتصل بدور المرأة في مكافحة الإرهاب ومنع التطرف العنيف، تبرز أهمية العمل على تطوير مسارات تنسيقية واضحة ضمن آلية الأمم المتحدة للتنسيق بشأن مكافحة الإرهاب الخاصة بالجمعيات البرلمانية، بما يسهم في تعزيز التعاون مع الوكالات الإنسانية والمنظمات المدنية والجهات الحكومية إلى جانب المجتمعات المتضررة، وبهدف توجه إلى دعم الجهود الرامية إلى تعزيز الحماية الفعالة للنساء والفتيات في سياقات النزاع والهشاشة من خلال مقاربات شاملة تراعي الأبعاد القانونية والإنسانية والاجتماعية وتكامل الأدوار بين مختلف الشركاء، وهو ما ينسجم مع استضافة الدوحة لمكتب برنامج الأمم المتحدة المعني بالمشاركة البرلمانية في مكافحة الإرهاب ومنعه، باعتباره منصة مؤسسية داعمة لتعزيز هذا التنسيق وترسيخ البعد البرلماني في الجهود الدولية ذات الصلة. الإخوة والأخوات، كان لمجلس الشورى بدولة قطر شرف المشاركة في تنظيم المنتدى العالمي للنساء البرلمانيات في الدوحة خلال العام 2024 بالتعاون مع مكتب الأمم المتحدة لمكافحة الإرهاب، والذي تناول دور النساء البرلمانيات في تطوير وتنفيذ ومراقبة التشريعات والسياسات المعنية بمكافحة الإرهاب ومنع التطرف العنيف. وقد خلص المنتدى إلى جملة من التوصيات من أبرزها تعزيز مشاركة النساء البرلمانيات في صياغة السياسات وإدماج تمكين المرأة في التشريعات، وتعزيز التعاون البرلماني الدولي في هذا المجال. وانطلاقاً من قناعة دولة قطر بأن معالجة جذور الإرهاب تمثل المدخل الأنجع لمكافحته، أولت اهتماماً خاصاً بدعم النساء في مناطق النزاعات من خلال التعليم والتأهيل وبناء القدرات، بما يسهم في تعزيز ثقافة السلام والعدالة ويحد من استغلال الفئات الأكثر هشاشة. وفي ظل التحديات الأمنية الراهنة تبرز أهمية إدماج المرأة في سياسات مكافحة الإرهاب، لا سيما ما يتعلق بمواجهة العنف ضد المرأة، سواء من خلال دورها المجتمعي أو عبر الأطر التشريعية التي توفر الحماية والدعم للضحايا. وفي الختام أجدد تقديري لجهود المشاركين والمشاركات في هذا المنتدى وحرصكم على مناقشة التحديات ووضع التوصيات والمقترحات الكفيلة بتعزيز دور المرأة البرلمانية في بناء مجتمعات أكثر عدلاً وأماناً. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
I wish to thank Her Excellency Dr. Hamda bint Hassan Al-Salwiti for her remarks and for the excellent work of the UN office in Doha on counterterrorism, our partner. Now, unfortunately, the Deputy Speaker of the Parliament of Albania, Her Excellency Claudiana Spayu was unable to join us in person. However, she was very kind to share with us a video message, which we will now have the pleasure of viewing.
Excellencies, honorable members, distinguished guests, it's a great privilege to address you at the second session of PAM Women Parliamentary Forum. I would like to warmly thank our host, the UAE Federal National Council, and in particular Her Excellency Mariam bin Taneya, for the excellent organization of this important event. I also extend my appreciation to the PAM Secretariat and all delegation for their continued commitment to advancing the role of women in peace, security and sustainable development, especially with the framework of PAM presidency on the UN Coordination Mechanism for Parliamentary Assemblies on Counter-Terrorism. I would like to extend my apologies. I deeply wished to be present in person, but demands of the parliamentary EU integration agenda made this impossible. Honorable guests, women and girls continue to face strong challenges, especially in situations of conflict, instability, and humanitarian crisis. According to UN data, 2 out of 3 women experience gender-based violence in such context. Yet, women are often the first responders in emergencies. This is why the Women, Peace and Security agenda remains as relevant today as ever. Its 4 pillars, prevention, protection, participation, and relief and recovery, remind us that sustainable peace cannot be achieved without the full and meaningful participation of women. In this context, the focus on the role of women in countering terrorism and preventing violent extremism is both timely and essential. As a representative of Albanian Parliament, I would like to reaffirm our strong commitment to the global fight against terrorism. Our Parliament had adopted key legislation, including laws on countering the financing of terrorism, international restrictive measures, amendments to the Criminal Code addressing terrorist offences, and the ratification of major international conventions. In parallel, Albania has adopted a comprehensive cross-sectoral strategy for the prevention of violent extremism and the fight against terrorism, promoting close coordination among institutions and international partners. At the same time, we firmly believe that security measures alone are not enough. Counter-terrorism efforts must respect human rights and integrate a gender-sensitive approach, recognizing women not only as victims but as key actors in prevention, resilience, and peace. In this spirit, the PAM Women Parliamentary Forum plays a crucial role. Let it continue to serve as a platform for cooperation, dialogue, and action, reminding us that empowering women is not only a matter of rights, but a foundation for peace, stability, and sustainable development. Thank you for your attention, and I wish you a successful and productive session.
Thank you to Claudiana for her contribution to this meeting. Now we will follow with another video message by Honorable Rita Superman, from Cyprus, who is the PAM Rapporteur on Counterterrorism, and she's the chair of the Policy Dialogue in the UN Coordination Mechanism for Parliamentary Assembly on Counterterrorism. The video, please.
Excellencies, honorable delegates and colleagues, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. It is an honor to address this forum today as PAM Rapporteur on Counter-Terrorism and Chair of the Policy Dialogue within the UN Coordination Mechanism for Parliamentary Assemblies on Counter-Terrorism. I wish to extend my gratitude to Honorable Mariam bin Taneya, President of the PAM Women's Parliamentary Forum, and to the UAE Federal National Council for the efforts made in supporting the organization of the forum. We meet amidst a very turbulent time characterized by mistrust and fragmentation that leave fertile ground for terrorists and criminal groups to take root and spread. The threat from terrorist groups such as Daesh and Al-Qaeda and their affiliates remains high, especially in the MENA region, Sahel and Sub-Saharan Africa. Terrorism impacts women and girls in diverse ways and disproportionately, with terrorist groups often targeting women's rights to education and public life and using rape, forced marriage, and other forms of sexual violence as weapons. Women and girls are also exploited for recruitment and are the most often victims of human trafficking. As parliamentarians, we shall incorporate gender analysis into our policies and programs, recognizing that terrorism and counter-terrorism affect people differently to create more effective rights-respecting strategies. Having had the honor as a special rapporteur to take part in a number of international expert meetings on counter-terrorism, as well as meetings of the UN Coordination Mechanism on Counter-Terrorism that PAM chairs, allow me to share with you some recommendations based on knowledge gained. National parliaments and inter-parliamentary assemblies should support and guide relevant executive branches to conduct research on gender dynamics of violent extremism and proceed to policy analysis. Legislators should also encourage the revision and re-evaluation of existing counter-terrorism policies and legislation to introduce a more gender-sensitive approach at the national and regional level. Gender mainstreaming must be incorporated at every level of policymaking related to preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism. Parliamentarians should undertake advocacy for strengthening the international normative framework on gender equality and women's rights, ensuring its implementation at all levels. Gender mainstreaming should be transversal and systematic in all policies. National and international parliaments have the duty to consider developing and/or updating existing legislative framework on gender-sensitive budgeting, funding counter-terrorism strategies and policies that prioritize the well-being of women and girls. This forum's meeting today in the Emirates is of the utmost importance because it strengthens cooperation among women, parliamentarians, experts, delegates from parliamentary assemblies, representatives of UN agencies and other international and regional organizations. Ensuring inclusive programming and the meaningful participation of women and girls in decision-making is critical to addressing terrorism without perpetuating discriminatory practices. Looking ahead, I am confident that the outcomes of the second session of the PAM Women Parliamentary Forum will inspire concrete and actionable steps towards our shared vision and mission to achieve peace, stability, and full respect for human rights in all our regions. Before concluding, I wish to express special thanks to the UN Global Victims of Terrorism Support Program. Thanks to their cooperation, we have the honor of the presence today of Mrs. Grants Ican, a co-founder of the Women's Advocacy Network of Uganda and the victim herself of conflict-related sexual violence following abduction by the Lord's Resistance Army. It will be an honor to listen to her testimony and courage. I wish you all successful discussions and I thank you for your attention.
I wish to thank Honorable Rita Superman for her statement, and I can tell you that she is really good in sharing the policy dialogue and has brought a lot of attention and respect, I would say, for the work of our Assembly in that field, kindly supported by the Shura of Qatar for what concern the cost of the operations. Now we have finished, we came to the end of the opening session of the second day. We start with the session number 3, and I would like to ask our friend, Senator El Kial of Morocco, who is the president of PAM First Standing Committee, to join me at the podium to lead this session. Thank you very much.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم، والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين، أصحاب المعالي، الزميلات والزملاء، الضيوف الكرام، حضرات السيدات والسادة. يطيب لي في هذا الصباح وفي حضرة المجلس الوطني الاتحادي للإمارات العربية المتحدة وأمام هذا المحفل البرلماني رفيع المستوى أن أتولى تسيير الجلسة الثالثة من منتدى النساء البرلمانيات التابع لبرلمان البحر الأبيض المتوسط. وتخصص هذه الجلسة لمناقشة دور المرأة في الإرهاب والوقاية من التطرف العنيف ومكافحته مع تسليط الضوء على مساهمتها في السياسات العامة وفي تعزيز صمود المجتمعات وصياغة استراتيجيات الوقاية. اسمحوا لي بداية أن أشارك معكم القضايا الأساس حول هذا الموضوع. إن دور المرأة في جهود مكافحة الإرهاب وفي الوقاية من التطرف العنيف ومواجهته بات اليوم معترفا به على نطاق واسع كعامل محوري في فعاليات السياسات الأمنية سواء على الصعيدين الوطني أو الدولي. وتؤكد منظمة الأمم المتحدة باستمرار أن تهميش المرأة أو استبعادها من استراتيجيات الوقاية يضعف من فهمنا لآليات التطرف ويحد من أثر التدابير المعتمدة. وعلى العكس من ذلك فإن المشاركة الفاعلة للنساء تعزز مناعة المجتمعات في مواجهة الإيديولوجيات المتطرفة. ومنذ اعتماد القرار 1325 لمجلس الأمن التابع للأمم المتحدة سنة 2000 بشأن المرأة والسلام والأمن وما تلاه من قرارات لاحقة، أصبحت العلاقة بين إشراك النساء والوقاية من النزاعات ومكافحة الإرهاب محورا رئيسيا في اهتمامات الأمم المتحدة. وتشير برامج الأمم المتحدة الإنمائية إلى أن التهميش الاجتماعي وعدم المساواة بين الجنسين يعدان من العوامل البنيوية التي قد تسهم في ظاهرة التطرف، في حين أن تمكين المرأة يساهم في الحد من استقطاب المجتمعات المحلية إلى الخطابات المتطرفة باعتبارها الحضن الأول أمام الحصن الأول أمام انتشارها. تستند هذه المقاربة إلى معطيات ميدانية ملموسة بشأن ديناميات التجنيد والتطرف، حيث تشير أرقام هيئة الأمم المتحدة للمرأة إلى أن ما بين 15 و20% من المقاتلين الأجانب الذين التحقوا بتنظيم داعش في العراق وسوريا كانوا من النساء، وهي نسبة تصل في بعض السياقات الوطنية إلى نحو 30%. وتبرز هذه الأرقام أن النساء يمكن أن يكون ضحايا للتطرف العنيف أو مشاركات في ارتكابه، وفي ذات الوقت فاعلات أساسيات في عملية الوقاية من خطاب التطرف داخل أسرهن ومجتمعاتهن. تلعب النساء أيضا دورا محوريا داخل الأسرة والمجتمع، وغالبا ما يكن في الصفوف الأمامية لرصد مؤشرات التطرف المبكر وتعزيز خطابات بديلة قائمة على قيم التماسك المجتمعي. وقبل أن أفسح المجال للمتدخلتين، سنشاهد سويا رسالة مصورة من السفيرة كارمن جي كانتور، نائبة المدير التنفيذي للجنة التنفيذية لمكافحة الإرهاب التابعة لمجلس الأمن بالأمم المتحدة.
Distinguished delegates, excellencies, and colleagues, I truly wish that I could be with you in Abu Dhabi today. Unfortunately, a heavy snowstorm prevented me from being able to join you in person. On behalf of the Security Council Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, CTED, I would like to thank the PAM Women Parliamentary Forum for organizing this event and for its important work in promoting the empowerment of women and gender equality. And I would like to express my sincere gratitude to the UAE under the high patronage of Her Highness Shaikha Fatima bint Mubarak for generously hosting this event. It is an honor to open this session on the role of women in countering terrorism and preventing and countering violent extremism. We know that sustainable peace and security cannot be achieved without the full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of women at all levels of decision-making. This principle is at the center of the Women, Peace and Security WPS agenda, beginning with Security Council Resolution 1325 from 2000 and reinforced in subsequent resolutions that have emphasized women's leadership, agency, and voice in peace and security matters. The WPS framework calls for women to be included not merely as beneficiaries of policy, but as central actors in conflict prevention, resolution, and in fostering long-term resilience. Building on this foundation, Security Council Resolution 2242 from 2015 explicitly linked the WPS agenda to efforts on countering terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism, urging member states and the United Nations system to ensure women's participation and leadership in the development of strategies and measures to counter terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. It further called for gender-sensitive research on the drivers of radicalization to violence and on the impact of counter-terrorism measures on women's rights, and for these insights to shape evidence-based policies and programming. Resolution 2242 from 2015 also specifically mandated my office, the Security Council Counterterrorism Executive Directorate, CTED, to integrate gender as a cross-cutting issue in all our mandated tasks and activities, which we carry out in support of the Security Council and its Counterterrorism Committee. This includes our core mandate to assess member states' implementation of counterterrorism measures pursuant to the relevant Security Council resolutions and facilitate the provision of technical assistance in the areas where implementation gaps persist. The commitments to the integration of the WPS agenda in counterterrorism are also contained within the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Strategy, which has evolved to reflect the critical importance of gender perspectives and women's engagement across the 4 pillars of the strategy. In its reviews, member states have underscored the necessity of promoting the equal, meaningful, and effective participation of women and civil society, recognizing that inclusive strategies yield more sustainable outcomes and strengthen community resilience against violent extremism conducive to terrorism. CTED is committed to strengthening our collective efforts to advance the WPS agenda and translate its commitments into tangible actions that elevate women as decision makers, innovators, and leaders in counterterrorism and preventing and countering violent extremism. By fostering meaningful partnerships, investing in women-led initiatives, and ensuring that our collective strategies are responsive to the lived realities of women and girls affected by violence, we not only uphold our international obligations, but also strengthen the foundations of peace and security for all. I wish you fruitful discussions for the remainder of this event. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا. هذه المداخلة التي ركزت على المشاركة الفعالة للمرأة في صناعة القرار واستعراض قرارات الأمم المتحدة المرتبطة بالمرأة والسلام والأمن ومكافحة الإرهاب والنوع وسياسة مكافحة الإرهاب، وبالتالي خلصت إلى أن هذه القرارات يجب أن تتحول إلى أعمال على أرض الواقع ومن خلال شراكات فعالة. شكرا للسيدة السفيرة. والآن يشرفني أن أعطي الكلمة لسعادة النائبة جوانا ليما، وهي الرئيسة المؤسسة والرئيسة الفخرية لمنتدى النساء التابع لبرلمان البحر الأبيض المتوسط. وبهذه المناسبة لا بد أن نتقدم لها بالشكر الجزيل على ما بذلته في مرحلة التأسيس من أعمال وفعاليات من أجل أن نكون اليوم في هذا المنتدى وبهذا الشكل، ونتمنى أن تسير على نهجها وتطوير عملها السيدة النائبة مريم بنتية. الكلمة لسعادة النائبة جوانا ليما.
Merci. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs les délégués, chers invités, c'est avec honneur et plaisir que je m'adresse à vous aujourd'hui en tant que présidente émérite et fondatrice du Forum des femmes parlementaires de l'Assemblée parlementaire de la Méditerranée. Je voudrais également remercier l'honorable Mariam Bintenea et le Conseil national fédéral pour l'organisation de cet événement qui réunit divers acteurs afin d'aborder des questions d'une importance capitale pour les filles et les femmes, non seulement dans les régions membres de l'APM, mais aussi au-delà. L'APM a toujours consacré ses efforts à la prévention et à la lutte contre le terrorisme et l'extrémisme violent, notamment en adoptant de nombreuses résolutions contenant des recommandations politiques destinées aux Parlements membres de l'Assemblée. Nous pouvons affirmer que l'impact du terrorisme sur les femmes a des conséquences dévastatrices, comme par exemple l'apartheid de genre en Afghanistan, les enlèvements fréquents des femmes et des filles par des groupes terroristes dans les pays subsahariens et la situation désastreuse des femmes et des enfants retenus captifs par les Daesh. Face à la menace persistante du terrorisme et de l'extrémisme violent, l'ambition de faire de la voix des femmes un pilier incontournable dans la sécurité et la stabilité de la région devient alors une question centrale. L'objectif du Forum pour les femmes parlementaires est ainsi de progresser dans le programme Femmes, Paix et Sécurité pour renforcer le rôle des femmes dans la lutte contre le terrorisme, consolider la coopération inclusive pour la paix et assurer leur protection. Merci beaucoup pour votre attention.
شكرا لسعادة النائبة جوانا على هذه الكلمة التي استعرضت من خلالها اهتمامات برلمان البحر الأبيض المتوسط بهموم المرأة بشكل عام ومساهمة المرأة البرلمانية في الرفع من أداء النساء في مجالات متعددة. شكرا لما. والآن سنستمع لكلمة مصورة للسيدة باخيتا الرميثي المديرة التنفيذية لمركز منارة للتعايش والحوار.
Thank you to the moderator for that introduction, and a thanks to the Women Parliamentary Forum, and a special thanks to the Federal National Council for hosting and convening this timely and important discussion. And may I say it's an honor to be standing here among you all at the hub of my country's freedom of speech, discussions, and where most important matters are discussed among us. When we speak about preventing and countering violent extremism, it is important that we are clear what we're actually trying to solve. Traditional counterterrorism focuses on acts of violence, attacks, cells, and arrests. Prevention exists precisely because we learned, often painfully, that violence is not the beginning of the problem. It is the final stage of a much longer social, psychological, and ideological process. By the time violence occurs, prevention measures have failed. Prevention forces us to look and ask for different questions. Why do individuals become radicalized? Where do extremist ideas gain legitimacy? Who shapes identity, belonging, and meaning before violence becomes inevitable? Once we approach prevention from this lens, it becomes clear it is not just a security issue, but an identity issue as well. This is where gender, national messaging, and ideological ecosystems intersect. Gender is often misunderstood in counterterrorism discussions. It's framed as a moral or political add-on, something to be included because it aligns with equality agendas. This framing is incomplete, and it is evident through research and studies that violent extremism and extremism are gendered. Research shows us that recruitment strategies led by extremist organizations are gender specific. Narratives of grievances and belonging are also gender specific. And pathways for radicalization differ for men and women. And extremist groups and organizations understand this very well and mobilize this to their advantage. They use hyper-masculine ideals of honor, protection, and dominance for men, while exploiting women as symbols, recruiters, logistics, influencers, and fighters. My fellow colleague here mentioned that women are 13 15 to 30% of extremist organizations are made of women. And that shows us that women are not only victims, but play also a destructive role within extremist organizations, and they are utilized from these extremist organizations. And because extremist organizations use gender strategically, prevention that ignores this is structurally flawed. For many years, policy framework treated women in extremism as victims. While women are indeed disproportionately affected by extremist violence, this framing is incomplete and counterproductive. As research shows that 15 to 30% of women are in extremist contexts, they're used as recruiters, facilitators, family influencers in extremist organizations. So from a prevention lens and from a prevention point of view, the key question is not whether women should be involved or included, but how their existing influence can be redirected towards prevention rather than exploitation. And women can be essential actors in prevention strategy. Women can work as early detection. In early detection, prevention utilizes early detection as a strategy. Radicalization often begins in behavioral changes, and women as mothers, educators, or community members often are the first to notice this. Not because they're biologically made to notice this, but because they are within spaces that security, intelligence, government spaces cannot infiltrate or cannot detect. Women can also be used in counter-narrative messengers. They can be used as counter-narrative messengers. Because often counter-narrative messages that counter extremist narrative come from the state, come from security, come from intelligence agencies, or from international actors. And these are seen by the community as outside influence, as imposed, or as aiming for a political agenda. And they are often rejected. Messages coming from within the community are more effective. Peer-to-peer messaging is often more effective than a messaging that comes from a upper stream. And women have a high level of trust within societies and can be carriers of this counter-narrative messaging against extremism. And this brings me to national messaging. National messaging is one of the strongest counter-extremism strategies that exist out there. Providing a sense of belonging to citizens, for them to be national citizens and identify with their national identity before any other identity, proves to be a effective and successful counter-extremist strategy. But may I provide a criticism? National messaging in many countries often assume women are included and don't have them as co-owners in this national framing. And prevention is not just about responding to the threat, but building resilience before vulnerability appears. Including women as co-owners is absolutely essential because people protect what they help shape. If not, they will feel alienated and attracted to extremist narratives that come from the outside. And when people feel alienated, they will tend to find a sense of belonging somewhere else. And extremism feeds on alienation, which brings me to my most important point. Extremism nowadays does not present itself as violent anymore. Increasingly today, they operate through ideological ecosystems, including far right, but more so far left, narratives that may be legal, that may be non-violent, but can become vehicles for polarization, mobilization, and delegitimization over time. This is not an argument against left or right policies or left or right values, nor is it against human rights or equality. It is an analytical point that we must put into consideration. When women are excluded from national dialogue, what often occurs is not immediate radicalization, but ideological relocation, which in itself is not harmful, but is extremist organizations use ideologies of human rights, of equality, of democracy for their own political agenda. Because left narratives provide language of recognition, moral quality, belonging, activism as identity, a voice against authority. For women and youth that feel invisible in state-led national narrative, this provides them a sense of belonging. And extremists use that and abuse that to their advantage. Again, this issue is not in regards to left or right values, but when these values are used and abused by extremist organizations, such as the Muslim Brotherhood within Western democratic societies, they're used to fuel hatred, polarization, and extremism. The Muslim Brotherhood often embeds itself in civil and democratic societies, operating and utilizing these environments and laws for their own benefit. They use human rights languages. They frame themselves as defenders of women, equality, and humanity. They operate legally and non-violently at first. Over time, advocacy for equality can slowly be redirected. What appears to be campaigning for peace can become political projects aligned with extremist organizations. While women and youth think they're advocating for peace and equality unintentionally, not by them, but unintentionally by women and youth, but intentionally by these extremist organizations, they become supporters of terrorist organizations in regions that are often misunderstood and conflicted. And extremist organizations have become extremely skilled at moral reframing. They understand that youth and women no longer respond to violence at first. They no longer respond to recreating the Khalifa. They understand that the youth responds to human rights, advocacy, peace, children's rights. And that is, it may begin at such, but it develops, what we notice is it develops to a much dangerous landscape. They present themselves as humanitarian, ethical, and they monopolize moral language. Because ideological capture, as we've seen in the past, rarely feels extreme at the beginning. It starts with moral clarity, moves to polarization, moves to social inclusion, moves to refusal to engage with the other, and then finally moves to justification of harm. And it's a slippery slope. And activism becomes pro-hate, pro-polarization, and a premise for violence. And dehumanization becomes acceptable. The responsibility lays not in the youth and the women, but in policy frameworks that often parliamentarians create that need to engage women. They need to be inclusive. They need to speak to the hearts and minds of women and youth everywhere. They need to engage them as co-owners, not impose that policy upon them. As early detecting agents, and as essential core pillars for social resilience. Prevention is not just about reacting to extremism, but also strengthening social cohesion and strengthening resilience. And women are vital to that. In the UAE, our approach to prevention is targeted at investing in coexistence, dialogue, and inclusive national identity, including but not limited to institutions like the institution I currently direct, the Menara Center for Coexistence and Dialogue. Prevention in the UAE is treated as a social process, not a reactive process. And we have laws and frameworks that protect this value that we have inherited, that protect peace and coexistence, that make sure women and community leaders, faith leaders are co-owners in this policy and co-owners in this prevention strategy. Finally, I'd like to say when women engagement in prevention is essential and crucial, and it is how resilience is built before vulnerability emerges. Thank you.
شكرا. مداخلة متميزة انطلقت من سؤال جوهري: لماذا يصبح الأشخاص متطرفين؟ لتخلص إلى خلاصة جوهرية أن البعد الوقائي يسبق الجانب المتعلق بالتدخل العلاجي، وبذلك فالوقاية لا يمكن إلا أن تمر عبر الرسائل الوطنية التي تنمي الحس والانتماء للهوية المشتركة. وإقصاء المرأة من هذا الحوار الوطني يشكل عائقاً أمام عملية محاربة الإرهاب والوقاية من الإرهاب. شكراً على هذه المداخلة المتميزة. والآن يسعدنا أن نستمع إلى عرض تقدمه السيدة ناتاليا بيلييف، مسؤولة قضايا النوع الاجتماعي في مكتب الأمم المتحدة لمكافحة الإرهاب.
Dear colleagues, I'm sorry that the snowstorm prevented me from joining this panel in person, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to make this pre-recorded intervention. Full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of women in all spheres of life is strongly embedded in international law and frameworks. Convention on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women is the second most ratified human rights convention in the world. Just last year, the international community has commemorated 25 years since the adoption of the Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security that calls for full, equal, and meaningful participation, as well as incorporation of gender perspectives in all peace and security efforts. This commitment has been reconfirmed in the 8th review of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy adopted by consensus. Despite these strong frameworks, there's still significant implementation gap worldwide. In 2023, the Gender Unit of the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism, which I represent, assessed national counterterrorism centers or their equivalent. It revealed significant disconnect between women, peace, and security commitments and counterterrorism frameworks. Even if embedded into national legislation and frameworks, these commitments can only be implemented with consistent efforts, allocated resources, oversight, and political leadership. In the time I have, I would like to focus on two aspects: women as counterterrorism professionals and partnerships with women-led civil society and counterterrorism efforts. When it comes to counterterrorism entities, women still face resistance and structural barriers. Growing body of research underscores that diverse intelligence teams, especially those that include women, consistently produce more accurate, less biased assessments because they counter overconfidence, reduce groupthink, and systematically produce stronger, comprehensive analysis. However, women in counterterrorism institutions remain underrepresented and often perform administrative functions. This should and could be changed. For example, the UNOCT Global Fusion Cells program significantly advanced gender parity in intelligence services in Africa by increasing women's participation in its training from 5 to 13% in 2020 to 30% by 2025. This training also supported women in advancing to leadership and decision-making positions. While efforts aimed at increasing the number of women working in counterterrorism are important, the add women and stir approach will never work if women are added as symbolic participants and are expected to adapt to security institutions that have been historically gender blind. Simply inserting women into counterterrorism structures that are built on militarized, exclusionary, or biased assumptions does nothing and can even reinforce gendered harms. You will hear more about this in Ashley's presentation. Meaningful participation requires institutional gender mainstreaming, shifting power, addressing structural discrimination, valuing women's expertise and experience, integrating gender and intersectional perspectives, counterterrorism efforts. This is closely linked to partnerships with women-led civil society and their important role in preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism. There are many CTPCV initiatives that consult women because women have better access to communities, can provide unique intelligence information, or can prevent radicalization to terrorism through their family and community roles. All these approaches are examples of instrumentalizing women that reinforce harmful gender dynamics. Instead, women should be consulted because terrorism, as well as counterterrorism, impact women, men, boys, and girls differently, and therefore their views must be heard and incorporated. Women-led civil society organizations working at the community level often operate in a dangerous dual threat environment, where they're directly targeted by terrorist groups, while simultaneously being suspected of association with these groups by state security forces. If consultations with civil society are not approached as partnerships that are premised on safety of all participants, they become performative and can result in more harm. Parliamentarians have a big role to play in advancing full, equal, meaningful, and safe participation of women in preventing and countering terrorism and violent extremism. For example, parliamentarians can ensure that national counterterrorism laws and frameworks are aligned with human rights obligations and gender equality commitments. Counterterrorism laws are developed through inclusive consultations, and that the oversight mechanisms examine who is excluded from decision-making and why. Parliamentarians can ensure that national CTPCV strategies reflect differential impact of terrorism and counterterrorism on women and men, and consider other intersectional factors, such as race, religion, race, socioeconomic status. And finally, it's important to ensure that there are legal protections for women human rights defenders and civil society working in CTPCV. To conclude, I would like to invite you to visit Gender and Identity Factors platform that offers member states and other stakeholders tools for advancing gender-responsive counterterrorism. You can access the platform through the link here or scanning this QR code. It offers publicly accessible library of resources on gender and intersectionality, community of practice for member states and civil society organizations, and regular webinars. Later this year, the platform will also offer a foundational course on gender and intersectionality in CTPCVE and case studies highlighting promising gender mainstreaming practices. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا. مداخلة تدعو البرلمانيين والبرلمانيات إلى بذل عناية خاصة لتعزيز مشاركة آمنة للنساء في مكافحة الإرهاب، والاطلاع على الصفحة المتعلقة بمكتب الأمم المتحدة لمكافحة الإرهاب كفيل بالوقوف على مجموعة من الجهود التي تقوم بها المنظمة في هذا المجال. أعطي الكلمة الأخيرة في هذه الجلسة للسيدة إشليسي سوبرمانين، المديرة بالإنابة لشبكة العمل الخيري والأمن. تفضلي يا سيدي.
Excellencies, colleagues, and after that wonderful cultural dinner last night, friends. It's an honor to join you today, and I extend my sincere gratitude to the PAM Women Parliamentarian Forum, Her Highness Sheikha Fatima bint Mubarak, the Federal National Council of Abu Dhabi, and the State of the United Arab Emirates for bringing us together. And also, I promise you I'm the last speaker of the session. Conferences like this provide us a moment of reflection. As we think today about the role of women in countering terrorism and preventing and countering violent extremism, we do so, as we've heard from other speakers, on the backdrop of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda, marking 25 years since the passage of UN Security Council Resolution 1325 this past October. The 25th anniversary of the resolution invites us not only to celebrate progress, but to ask the harder questions. What kind of security have we built, and for whom? And what role have countering terrorism and violent extremism played in this security? The original goal of the Women, Peace and Security Agenda was demilitarization, anti-war, and through these aims, ultimately, sustainable peace. Countering terrorism and preventing violent extremism are no doubt incredibly important agendas, but they have also played a role in moving the Women, Peace and Security Agenda away from peace and toward securitization and militarization. For example, as we heard from previous speakers, in 2015, UN Security Council Resolution 2242 linked the Women, Peace and Security Agenda to counterterrorism and preventing and countering violent extremism. Allow me to share another perspective on this resolution. Through the passage of this resolution, women were no longer positioned as political actors shaping peace, but rather as tools of state-centric intervention. That is, as community informants, mothers against extremism, or early warning systems that increase operational efficiency for counterterrorism and violent extremism. Resolution 2538 took this securitized logic further still, focusing on gender parity in peacekeeping forces, equating progress with inclusion inside militarized institutions rather than promoting demilitarization itself, moving the WPS agenda away from its envisioned aims. Across these iterations, what began as a demand for structural change was reframed as a strategy for stabilization. Women's agency became instrumentalized to make security policy appear more inclusive. The agenda that was meant to make peace possible has too often been used to make war appear legitimate. And this is where I want us to dwell today, on how women's roles in countering terrorism and violent extremism frameworks present an opportunity for parliamentarians to use these agendas to indeed advance security, but not at the expense of peace. When we talk about advancing security through women's roles in these frameworks, we should consider human security. As a framework, this human security prioritizes people, centers community needs, and demands policies, priorities, and practices that serve women and gender minorities most on the margins. As we look to policy moments in 2026, we're coming up on the 9th review of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy. And this review comes at a time where countries like the United States are not only taking a wrecking ball to the international system, but are leading domestic and global efforts to roll back women's inclusion and rights. This presents another opportunity for, as the title of this conference notes, states from the Gulf to the Mediterranean to take a leading role in demanding that inclusion and rights for women and gender minorities be upheld and treated as fundamental and essential non-negotiables. Parliamentarians can and must work with their counterparts in embassies and UN missions to ensure that language on women and gender is both protected and advanced in the upcoming global counterterrorism strategy. It took years of concerted and intentional effort to get the language we have in there now, and we must not let this be undone. Pillar 1 of the global counterterrorism strategy entails measures to address the conditions conducive to the spread of terrorism. It's a deeply important aim. But as we think about this pillar and the role of women in countering terrorism and violent extremism, we have to also acknowledge the realities And this includes the irony that many measures designed to address the spread of terrorism and violent extremism actually end up creating the conditions conducive to it. I'd like to share a few concrete examples of this. In Syria, a women's organization working in ISIS-controlled areas provided secular education as a means to counter the education children received in ISIS-led schools. Many donors stopped providing financial support to this women's organization because ISIS is rightly designated as a foreign terrorist organization. And most engagement with entities with this counterterrorism designation are illegal under the US material support laws. While this example is in Syria, it's illustrative of a bigger trend, a chilling effect on funding for community-based organizations working in designated foreign terrorist organization-controlled areas, even when these organizations, often women-led, are on the front lines of working to combat and prevent the spread of extremism and violent extremism. When assistance to these areas is restricted due to counterterrorism measures, it leaves communities there with no choice but to depend on terrorist organizations for the essential services they would otherwise not receive. Not only does this work against the aims of counterterrorism and violent extremism measures, but it also has harmful gendered impacts. In these contexts, women's needs are deprioritized at best, and their rights are violated at worst. In Nigeria, a women's organization highlighted how specific measures within counterterrorism, such as countering the financing of terrorism, are killing their work, and the terrorists are still getting their money. In Gaza, we see before us the world's biggest violation of counterterrorism anywhere in the world. The gendered impacts include intensification of reproductive health complications, gender-based violence, heightened child marriage risks, starvation, and a lack of access to women's health. We have all heard the horrifying statistic that Palestinians killed by Israel's destructive military assault are disproportionately women and children. But Palestinian women are not statistics. They're humans deserving of dignity, safety, and respect. And counterterrorism measures being carried out in Palestine are preventing, not aiding, what they deserve. When we think about the gendered impacts of counterterrorism, women and gender minorities undoubtedly face these at disproportionate rates. But still, when discussing gendered impacts, we don't only mean women, we mean everyone. In the aftermath of the US-led so-called global war on terror, brown men and boys from predominantly Muslim-majority countries have consistently been labeled as terrorists, primarily from Western governments. In turn, brown women are labeled as needing saving from brown men. These harmful tropes are part of the machinery and narrative control inherent to countering terrorism and violent extremism. As these examples show, the securitizing and restricting humanitarian aid and access to basic services create the very conditions of alienation and desperation that terrorism and extremism feed on. And they're antithetical to Pillar 1 of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy. While women should of course be included in countering and preventing terrorism and violent extremism architectures, they should also be given scope, space, and leadership to fundamentally change these architectures and institutions. They must be enabled to shift the very infrastructure that, by design, derail peace and true security. And this brings us to Pillar 4 of the Global Counterterrorism Strategy, which entails measures to ensure respect for human rights and the rule of law as a fundamental basis of the fight against terrorism. This pillar demands that the pursuit of security must never override the protection of human rights and the rule of law. And parliamentarians are well placed to advance this demand because legislators sit at the intersection of law, accountability, and public trust. You have both the constitutional mandate and moral authority to insist that security measures serve people and not power. These are the essence of inclusive governance. Parliamentarians can work to help shift the narrative itself, away from one that views women merely as vulnerable victims and toward one that recognizes them as leaders, decision makers, and agents of change. In doing so, they reaffirm that women and gender are not an add-on to security, but a prerequisite for it. Excellencies, colleagues, and friends, I know I have been raising policy documents and strategies, but as we continue to explore women's roles, I invite us to move beyond the purely policy and technical and move towards the people. As my sister noted earlier, people-centered approaches to counterterrorism and violent extremism begin by asking whose security counts and who gets to decide. It is not about adding women to the table after the meal has been served. It's about questioning who built the table and who keeps being asked to clean up afterwards. It's about changing how the meal is made and consumed. As I conclude, let us return to the true spirit of women's roles in countering terrorism and violent extremism, and the peace aims the Women, Peace, and Security agenda was built upon. Measures that are built on exclusion are brittle. Measures that are built on inclusion are resilient and more effective. Women are not merely asking to be included in counterterrorism and violent extremism measures. We are asking for true political and decision-making power to change the shape, size, and scope and color of these measures. We are asking for these measures to prioritize human rather than hard security. And we are demanding that the ultimate goal of any security measures, including countering terrorism and violent extremism, be peace. This is not a naive demand for some distant future. It's a long overdue demand that women and the world need. Thank you.
شكرا جزيلا على هذه الكلمة المتميزة والتي تعتبر أن المرأة شرط أساسي للأمن ومكافحة الإرهاب. الآن الكلمة للكولونيل دانا حميد المرزوقي المدير العام بمكتب الشؤون الدولية بوزارة الداخلية في دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة.
Assalamu alaikum. I would like to apologize to Her Excellency Ms. Ashley, because she promised you that she was the last speaker on the session, so I'm gonna try to make my remarks very short. I'm very grateful for the way she ended her remarks, because it feeds very well into the beginning of mine. So I'm a colonel of the police. I'm a law enforcement officer, and you might ask yourself, what am I doing in a conversation about conflict zone and empowering women in conflict zones? We actually have a very strong direction in the United Arab Emirates towards empowering women in particular in areas of conflict zones, whether from an army, an armed force perspective, or from a police perspective. That's thanks to Her Highness Sheikha Fatma bint Mbarak, the mother of the nation, who started this initiative years ago with a vision that women should play a more active role being on the field, dealing with communities that are ravaged and are dealing with conflict and wars. She started with training people for more than 18 countries. Those women are now 600 women from all of those countries that are working in the field, in conflict zones, dealing with communities' displacement, dealing with violence against women and violence-based gender, and supporting their fellow brothers on the front lines. When it comes to policing, there's a significant effort that the United Nations is doing under the UN police. And I've come to become familiar with it years ago under the direction of His Highness Sheikh Saif bin Zayed Al Nahyan, my commander. What they do is something very significant, actually. So once a conflict zone is no longer declared a conflict zone and it came back to peace, UN police go down on the ground with forces of both women and men, and try to restore security and safety on the ground. We all understand that post-conflict, safety and security is the #1 concern for any stability that any community is hoping for or dreaming about. So what those forces do is actually go on the ground and try to restore peace, safety, and security through policing services that are either community services, investigation, traffic, gender-based violence investigation, and so forth. What changed in the past 5 years that the direction in the United Nations have shifted from only focusing on available police officers to serve on the field to demanding that every nomination from every country include women. So it's now part of the recruitment policy to have women serve in UN police, whether any country nominates any police officers from their force. Where does the United Arab Emirates fit in this direction? We have very strong presence when it comes to the UN police through their peacekeeping missions. The United Arab Emirates is a country that's built on safety and security and have been voted the safest country in the world years and years and years consecutively. We have learned and mastered the art of dealing with our community, whether it's diverse in race and religion or in ethnicity. We have more than 200 nationalities living in the United Arab Emirates, and we've learned how to provide policing services in the form of services, actually. And we've moved from traditional policing to advanced policing that put human being at the forefront of the service. So what we are doing with the United Nations for the past 5 years, we have been working with them in training their officers. So we host their officers to teach them on performance management. We also host their female officers with different themes every year to the commanding lady officers that are in the UN police. 2 of the subjects that we've been training on have been addressed by my fellow lady speakers. One, dealing with extremism and radicalization. As Ms. Meitha mentioned in her remarks, women are very well equipped and positioned to acknowledge and detect early stages of radicalization in their community, in their household, and in their community. So one of the areas we've been working with female commanders in the UN police is that. We work on scientific methods and we work on practical methods that will help them be able to teach community leaders where they serve in post-conflict zone to detect early signs of radicalization and work very closely with faith leaders in those communities to be able to reverse those signs and bring people back to a moderate existence of religion or political belief. The second area we work on very passionately, and it's one of my passions, to be honest, is gender-based violence. And gender-based violence can be physical violence and also sexual violence. And women, not only living in those communities, post-conflict communities, are facing gender-based violence. Police commanders, female police commanders, are also facing gender-based violence in those areas. And in order for them to protect women and children in those, and people of determination, and minorities in their communities, to protect them from gender-based violence or violence against minor communities, they need to understand their safety first. You cannot give if you are not able to do that from a place of confidence and a place of security and safety within your own rights. So this is an area we've been working on successfully, alhamdulillah. We have managed to have many successful trainings that addressed hundreds of those female police officers and commanders with the direction of our leadership in the United Arab Emirates. And Sheikh Mohammed bin Zayed Al Nahyan, our president, have met with those forces multiple times and assured them that the United Arab Emirates believes in work on the ground from women and men during conflict, but we also believe in the work of women and men post-conflict. In conclusion, because I understand I'm standing between you and between a break, we need to think out of the box. Women's role right now are not just continuing on tasks that are set out by commanders and policymakers when it comes to post-conflict zones work. Women are able to participate in negotiating peace deals, and we found that more than 30% of peace deals that women participated in lasted longer than peace deals that they were not part of, and this is a great significant number to redirect our attention again to engaging women in negotiating peace deals. Not only that, we found that when women work on post-conflict policing and security, they are able to contribute more than 24% in the economy emerging of new communities in a successful way that would help create economic opportunities for people post-conflict zones. Also, we found that women commanders in particular are more able to deal with community leaders on the ground, whether they were men or women or faith leaders or political leaders on the ground than men. The ability to converse, the ability to communicate, the ability to present always the human perspective of every action and every decision has surpassed that of men on the field. Obviously, women and men have to exist line in line, and they do for the sake of safeties of communities they are protecting. But also, it is also very smart to acknowledge what each brings to the table in order for us to maximize our existence as police officers and as army personnel when we are in conflict zone or in post-conflict zone. I hope that I was able to present the opposite perspective from action on the field, and I hope that it complemented previous speakers. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا على هذه المداخلة. لكن هل الأمر يتعلق بالترجمة عندما نتحدث عن رجال ونساء الأمن؟ ليس رجال الأمن، لأنه اليوم الجندرة تفرض أن نتحدث عن نساء الأمن، وهذه المداخلة تبين عن الأدوار الأساسية التي تقوم بها المرأة في مجال مكافحة الإرهاب من موقع المؤسسة الأمنية. شكرا لكل المتدخلات وفي هذا الصباح، والآن أفتح باب النقاش وأعطي الكلمة لسعادة النائبة أمينة الجيدة من دولة قطر.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، السيدات والسادة، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته مرة أخرى. يسعدني أن أشارك معكم اليوم في هذا المنتدى البرلماني الرفيع الذي يجمعنا لمناقشة أحد أخطر التحديات التي تواجه مجتمعاتنا المعاصرة، والمتمثل في الإرهاب والتطرف العنيف وما يترتب عليهما من آثار تمس الأمن المجتمعي والسلم الاجتماعي. تنطلق دولة قطر في جهودها لمكافحة الإرهاب ومنع التطرف العنيف من نهج يقوم على الوقاية المجتمعية المبكرة، انطلاقاً من قناعة راسخة بأن مواجهة التطرف لا تبدأ من الإجراءات الأمنية فقط، بل من بناء الوعي الفكري وتعزيز التماسك الاجتماعي وترسيخ قيم الاعتدال والحوار، مع العلم بأن دولة قطر بفضل الله تعالى لا تعاني من العنف المرتبط بالإرهاب. وفي هذا الإطار تشارك المرأة القطرية بفاعلية في برامج التوعية المجتمعية التي تهدف إلى الوقاية من التطرف الفكري، لا سيما من خلال المدارس والجامعات والمراكز الثقافية والمنصات، بما يسهم في حماية الأجيال الناشئة من الفكر المتطرف وتعزيز ثقافة السلم والعيش المشترك. وعلى المستوى التشريعي والرقابي يطلع مجلس الشورى بدولة قطر بدور داعم السياسات الوطنية ذات الصلة بالتماسك الأسري والتلاحم الاجتماعي، حيث ناقش المجلس تقاريراً وخططاً مقدمة من الجهات المختصة، من بينها وزارة الأوقاف والشؤون الإسلامية، وزارة التنمية الاجتماعية والأسرة، وزارة التربية والتعليم العالي. ركزت على تعزيز دور الأسرة والتربية والتعليم كركيزتين أساسيتين في منع التطرف العنيف والتصدي لأسباب الفكرية والاجتماعية. أضف إلى ذلك الدور الذي تقوم به وزارة الثقافة في تعزيز الهوية الثقافية واحترام التنوع الثقافي. كما تحرص دولة قطر على الإسهام في الحوار الدولي وتبادل الخبرات وأفضل الممارسات في هذا المجال من خلال السنوات الثقافية وإقامة المعارض والمنتديات والمؤتمرات التي تشارك فيها شخصيات نسائية قطرية وإقليمية دولية، وتعد منصات لبناء جسور السلام وأداة لمناقشة القضايا المرتبطة بالتنمية المستدامة، وتعزيز إدماج المرأة في الجهود الدولية لمكافحة العنف ضد المرأة المرتبطة بالإرهاب. إن التجربة القطرية تؤكد أن إدماج المرأة في عمليات صنع السياسات وسن التشريعات وأطر التنفيذ المتعلقة بمكافحة العنف المرتبط بالإرهاب ليس خياراً تكميلياً، بل ضرورة لتحقيق استجابات أكثر شمولاً واستدامة لتعزيز السلام. كما تبرز أهمية تعزيز الشبكات القائمة بين البرلمانيين والهيئات الدولية والمجتمع المدني، بما يسهم في دعم مشاركة المرأة وتبادل التجارب الناجحة وأفضل الممارسات في هذا المجال. وختاماً، نأمل أن تسهم هذه الجلسة في تبادل الخبرات واستخلاص الدروس المستفادة وصياغة توصيات عملية تعزز الدور الوقائي للمرأة وتدعم الجهود المشتركة لمواجهة التطرف العنيف، بما يخدم أمن واستقرار مجتمعاتنا في منطقتنا ومنطقة البحر الأبيض المتوسط. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
شكرا للمتدخلة. أود أن لا نتجاوز دقيقتين في كل تدخل حتى نتمكن من الاستماع إلى كل التدخلات. الكلمة لسعادة النائبة فيفان تايت اليوم، الجمعية البرلمانية الفرنكوفونية.
Excellences, honorables parlementaires, chers collègues, en vos titres et qualités, le réseau des femmes parlementaires que j'ai l'honneur de présider promeut une meilleure participation des femmes à la vie politique, économique, sociale et culturelle, et ce tant au niveau national que dans l'ensemble de l'espace francophone. Le rôle des femmes dans la lutte contre le terrorisme et la prévention et la lutte contre l'extrémisme violent est à la fois essentiel, urgent et profondément politique. Le terrorisme et l'extrémisme violent ne sont pas seulement des menaces sécuritaires, ce sont des phénomènes complexes, enracinés dans des fractures sociales, des injustices, des exclusions et des discours de haine. C'est pourquoi les femmes doivent jouer un rôle central dans cette approche. Cela signifie garantir la participation des femmes à l'élaboration des stratégies de sécurité, soutenir les programmes d'éducation et d'autonomisation, protéger les droits fondamentaux et combattre les discours extrémistes, y compris en ligne. Les femmes sont souvent en première ligne de la prévention dans les familles, les écoles, les communautés. Elles détectent les premiers signes de radicalisation, elles transmettent les valeurs de dialogue, de respect et de citoyenneté. Les femmes sont également des victimes spécifiques du terrorisme et de l'extrémisme violent, mais elles ne doivent jamais être réduites à ce seul statut. Le terrorisme peut réduire les femmes en esclavage sexuel, mais il échoue dès lors qu'elles survivent, témoignent et transforment leur corps martyrisé en arme de vérité contre l'idéologie qui voulait les faire taire. Mais reconnaître cette contribution ne peut conduire à une vision idéalisée ou naïve. Certaines femmes participent en effet activement à des dynamiques terroristes comme recruteuses, relais idéologiques ou actrices directes de la violence. Le nier affaiblirait la compréhension de la réalité terroriste et compromettrait l'efficacité des politiques de prévention. Une approche féministe implique donc de reconnaître leurs différents engagements, actrices de paix, autrices de violence ou victimes. L'engagement peut donc être protecteur ou destructeur. Au sein de l'APF, pour le réseau des femmes parlementaires, la lutte contre le terrorisme devient durable lorsqu'elle transforme les femmes en actrices de pouvoir, pas seulement en relais sociaux. Le terrorisme ne connaît pas de frontières, notre réponse doit être collective, solidaire et déterminée. Le terrorisme ne recule pas quand on répète les mêmes recettes, mais quand on ose les combattre là où il se reproduit, dans les silences, les angles morts et les renoncements politiques. Chers collègues, l'égalité n'est pas l'innocence, c'est la responsabilité partagée. Je vous remercie pour votre attention.
شكرا. الكلمة لسعادة النائبة إليا خير سيدي المختار من البرلمان العربي.
شكرا. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين أصحاب المعالي والسعادة السيدات والسادة الحضور الكريم، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. لقد أظهرت التجارب المريرة التي شهدتها العديد من الدول في العقدين الآخرين أن المرأة ليست فقط ضحية للإرهاب، بل هي أيضا عنصر فاعل في مواجهته. فالمرأة تقوم بدور رئيسي في بناء الوعي داخل الأسرة والمجتمع، وهي القادرة على زرع قيم الاعتدال والتسامح والانتماء منذ السنوات الأولى في النشأة. وقد أكد البرلمان العربي على ضرورة تعزيز دور المرأة في تحقيق الأمن المجتمعي والمواجهة الفكر المتطرف، واعتمد في سبتمبر 2024 الوثيقة البرلمانية للمرأة العربية، والتي تهدف إلى تعزيز دور المرأة العربية في مختلف المجالات، في مقدمتها الأدوار التنموية والتربوية المرتبطة بالأمن والسلم المجتمعي من أجل الوقاية من الفكر المتطرف. كما أكدت الوثيقة على دور المرأة في نشر ثقافة التسامح والحوار داخل الأسرة والمجتمع. وفي هذا السياق اسمحوا لي أن أستغل فرصة المشاركة في هذا المنتدى لأطرح باسم البرلمان العربي بعض التوصيات ذات الصلة بالموضوع هذه الجلسة، وهي أولاً ضرورة ربط استراتيجيات مكافحة الإرهاب ببرامج تمكين المرأة، خصوصاً في المناطق المهمشة أو المتأثرة بالنزاعات، لأنه كلما كانت المرأة ممكنة اقتصادياً وتعليمياً وسياسياً كلما تضاءت فرص تجنيدها أو استغلالها من قبل التنظيمات الإرهابية. ثانياً ضرورة إدماج النساء في صياغة السياسات الوطنية لمكافحة الإرهاب كمشاركات في صنع القرار، حيث يسهم ذلك في بناء مقاربة شاملة ومستدامة لمواجهة التطرف العنيف. وفي الختام أؤكد أن الإرهاب ليس مجرد ظاهرة أمنية، بل هو تهديد شامل لبنية المجتمعات وثقافاتها وقيمها. وفي خضم هذا التهديد تبرز المرأة في الخطوط الأمامية، لا كضحية فقط بل كشريك في المواجهة. أشكركم على حسن الاستماع، والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته.
شكرا. الكلمة لسعادة النائبة لينا حبيب قاسم من البحرين.
شكرا. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. الزميلات والزملاء الكرام، يسعدني أن أشارككم هذه الجلسة التي تلامس أحد أكثر الملفات حساسية وتعقيدا في منطقتنا الأوروبية المتوسطية والخليجية، وهو دور المرأة في مواجهة الإرهاب ومنع التطرف العنيف، لا من زاوية أمنية ضيقة بل من منظور مجتمعي شامل يرتبط بالأمن والاستقرار وبناء السلام المستدام. ولعل السؤال الذي يفرض نفسه في هذا السياق هو: هل يمكن مواجهة التطرف بالأدوات الأمنية وحدها؟ أم أن الوقاية الحقيقية تبدأ من داخل المجتمع، من الأسرة ومن منظومة القيم التي تشكل وعي الأجيال؟ لقد أثبتت التجارب الإقليمية والدولية أن إشراك المرأة في جهود الوقاية من التطرف ومكافحته ليست إجراء تكميلياً، بل عاملاً حاسماً في تحقيق نتائج مستدامة في المرأة بحضورها الطبيعي في الأسرة والمجتمع، تمثل جسراً فاعلاً لتعزيز القيم الإنسانية وبناء الوعي والتصدي المبكر للفكر المتطرف، لا سيما بين فئة الشباب والأجيال الناشئة، في البيئات الحضرية والريفية على حد سواء. في مملكة البحرين أدركت القيادة الحكيمة لحضرة صاحب الجلالة الملك حمد بن عيسى الخليفة ملك البلاد المعظم حفظه الله ورعاه، وبدعم ومساندة من صاحب السمو الملكي الأمير سلمان بن حمد آل خليفة ولي العهد رئيس مجلس الوزراء حفظه الله، الدور المحوري للمرأة في بناء مجتمع متماسك وآمن. ومن هذا المنطلق جرى إدماج تمكين المرأة كأحد المرتكزات الأساسية في الاستراتيجية الوطنية لمكافحة الإرهاب والتطرف ضمن مقاربة متكاملة تشارك فيها السلطتان التشريعية والتنفيذية إلى جانب المجتمع المدني. وفي هذا الإطار لم يقتصر دور المرأة البحرينية على المساهمة السياسية أو الاقتصادية، بل امتد ليشمل الأمن المجتمعي والثقافي والفكري، فقد اطلعت بأدوار نوعية في القطاع الأمني وأسهمت بفاعلية في تنفيذ برامج وطنية للتوعية والوقاية من الفكر المتطرف، لا سيما تلك الموجهة إلى الشباب والأسر. كما قادت المرأة البحرينية مبادرات لتعزيز الحوار بين الثقافات والأديان وترسيخ قيم التسامح والتعايش السلمي، بما أسهم في بناء نموذج وطني قائم على الشمولية والتنوع والمشاركة المجتمعية. وأكسب تجربة البحرين حضوراً إيجابياً على المستويين الإقليمي والدولي. السيدات والسادة، إن المرحلة المقبلة تضع أمامنا مسؤولية جماعية تفرض تعزيز التعاون البرلماني الإقليمي بين دول الخليج ودول البحر الأبيض المتوسط، ليس فقط لتبادل التجارب بل لتنسيق السياسات الداعمة لتمكين المرأة في جهود مكافحة التطرف، مع التركيز على الوقاية والتعليم وإشراكها في صناعة القرار الأمني والاجتماعي. فتمكين المرأة في هذا المجال لا ينبغي أن ينظر إليه كخيار سياسي، بل باعتباره مسؤولية وطنية وإقليمية مشتركة، وعنصراً أساسياً في بناء السلام وترسيخ الاستقرار وضمان مجتمعات قادرة على مواجهة التحديات المستقبلية بوعي وتماسك. شكراً لكم.
شكراً. الكلمة لسعادة النائبة مراتي صالي مراتي من مقدونيا الشمالية. إذا لم تكن موجودة أعطي الكلمة للسيدة مديا سعادة النائبة مديا الممهالي الإمارات العربية المتحدة.
عفوا، الاسم مضحي المنهالي. سعادة مريم بن ثنية رئيس المنتدى النساء البرلماني لدى برلمان البحر الأبيض المتوسط، أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، في ظل تفاقم التحديات الأمنية على الصعيد العالمي، يكشف مؤشر الإرهاب العالمي لعام 2025 أن الهجمات الإرهابية أسفرت خلال عام 2023 عن أكثر من 8000 ضحية، إلى جانب اتساع نطاق الدول المتأثرة بهذه الظاهرة من 58 دولة في عام 2023 إلى 66 دولة في عام 2024، وهو ما يبرز الحاجة الماسة إلى اعتماد مقاربات شاملة تعزز دور المرأة بوصفها عنصراً محورياً في جهود الوقاية من التطرف وبناء السلام المستدام. السيدات والسادة، في هذا الإطار تؤكد دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة التزاماً مؤسسياً متقدماً في مجال مكافحة تمويل الإرهاب من خلال إطلاق استراتيجيتها الوطنية للأعوام 2024 و2027 الهادفة إلى مواجهة غسيل الأموال ومكافحة تمويل الإرهاب والتصدي لتمويل انتشار التسلح. كما عززت دولة الإمارات بنيتها المؤسسية ذات الصلة عبر تأسيس مركز هداية في عام 2012 كمنصة دولية رائدة لمكافحة التطرف العنيف، وإنشاء مركز صواب في عام 2015 لمكافحة التطرف عبر الإنترنت لا سيما في الفضاء الرقمي. وعلى صعيد ترسيخ قيم التسامح والتعايش السلمي، استحدثت دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة منصباً لوزير التسامح، وأسست بيت العائلة الإبراهيمي بوصفه رمزاً حضارياً للتعايش ورسالة إنسانية عالمية تؤكد أهمية الحوار بين الأديان وتعزيز ثقافة السلام والتعايش المشترك محلياً ودولياً. كما قامت دولة الإمارات بإشراك المرأة في مكافحة الإرهاب والتطرف العنيف، وهو ما يتسق مع إطار الأمم المتحدة، ولا سيما أجندة المرأة والسلام والأمن عبر القرار 1325 والقرارات اللاحقة التي عززت الدور المركزي للمرأة في الوقاية من التطرف وبناء السلام. وقد كانت دولة الإمارات من أوائل الدول الداعمة لتنفيذ هذه القرارات على المستوى الوطني، فقد أطلقت أول خطة وطنية خليجية لتنفيذ إطار المرأة والسلام والأمن في مارس عام 2021 بمبادرة كريمة من سمو الشيخة فاطمة بنت مبارك أم الإمارات لتعزيز مشاركة المرأة في صياغة وتنفيذ السياسات الوقائية والمجتمعية. السيدات والسادة، تؤكد الشعبة البرلمانية الإماراتية على التالي: دمج المرأة في صميم كافة الاستراتيجيات والجهود الرامية لمكافحة الإرهاب والتطرف العنيف من خلال إشراكها في صياغة وتنفيذ ومراقبة السياسات والتشريعات ذات الصلة. ثانياً، تتجلى أهمية تطوير تشريعات وطنية داعمة لتعليم الفتيات وتمكين المرأة، ركيزة أساسية في تعزيز قدرتها في صنع القرار، ولا سيما في مجال الأمن والسلم والعمل الإنساني، إذ يسهم هذا التمكين التشريعي في ترسيخ دور المرأة كشريك استراتيجي في مواجهة التحديات المعاصرة، بما يؤدي إلى بناء مجتمعات أكثر صلابة ومناعة. ثالثاً، الاستفادة من أدوات التكنولوجيا الحديثة، لا سيما الذكاء الاصطناعي ومنصات التواصل الاجتماعي لدعم جهود المرأة في مجال مكافحة الوقاية ومكافحة الفكر المتطرف وتعزيز الوعي المجتمعي. السيدات والسادة، ما يتزامن مع موضوع جلستنا لهذا اليوم، يسعدني أن أحيطكم علماً بأن الأمم المتحدة اعتمدت اليوم 28 يناير وبمبادرة من مملكة البحرين الشقيقة يوماً دولياً للتعايش السلمي، في تأكيد دولي على أهمية نشر قيم السلام والتسامح بين الشعوب. والإمارات هي نموذجاً رائداً ورمزاً عالمياً للتعايش، حيث تحتضن أكثر من 200 جنسية من مجتمعات دينية متعددة يعمها السلام والأمن والاستقرار. وفي الختام، نشكركم جميعاً ويسعدني الترحيب بكم مرة أخرى في دولة الإمارات العربية المتحدة، وشكراً لكم.
شكراً للسيدة النائبة. وبما أنه اليوم العالمي للتعايش والتسامح، كذلك كان عندنا التسامح في الوقت، فأرجو من باقي المتدخلين عدم تجاوز دقيقتين. الكلمة لسعادة النائب جميل تحيسات الحجاي من الأردن.
بسم الله، الحمد لله، والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. شكرا لمنظمي هذا المؤتمر وللجهود التي بذلت من أجل إنجاحه على أكمل وجه. شاكرين لكم هذه الجهود الطيبة المباركة. نحن في الأردن لدينا تجارب جيدة في تمكين دور المرأة في مختلف القضايا المجتمعية من خلال برامج وتطبيقات مختلفة ومتنوعة في كافة القضايا من أجل مكافحة الإرهاب والتطرف، وذلك لأن للمرأة دور كبير جدا في هذه المسألة، باعتبارها خط الدفاع الأول عن القضايا الإرهابية وهذه الأمور المتعلقة في قربها جدا من أبنائها ومتابعتها الحثيثة لهم ومعرفتها الحقيقية لأي تغيرات تظهر على هؤلاء الأبناء من البداية، لتكون هي فعلا الحصن والخط الأول للدفاع عن قضية الإرهاب في بواكيره. لذا كان من الواجب تمكين المرأة تعليميا وفكريا لتعزيز قدرتها على تفكيك الخطاب المتطرف ومواجهته، وهي شريك في الوقاية المجتمعية من خلال دورها في المدارس والجامعات والجمعيات المختلفة، لأن خطابها مؤثر في إعادة دمج المتعافين أيضا من التطرف والإرهاب بعد خروجهم منه. لذا يجب مراجعة كافة التشريعات التي تمكن المرأة من القيام بدورها في محاربة ومكافحة هذه الآفة المدمرة من خلال تعزيز دورها الاقتصادي، لأن ذلك يقلل من بيئات الهشاشة الاقتصادية والفقر التي يستغلها الإرهاب في مثل هذه الحالات، وكذلك تمكينها أيضا من القيادة في بعض المواقع كقيادات نسوية تعزز الثقة المجتمعية وتقوي المناعة ضد الفكر المتطرف. وفي هذه المناسبة لا ننسى أن المرأة في غزة قد تعرضت إلى إرهاب مدمر وإلى محاولات تشريد وقتل. هذه المرأة بحد ذاتها هي أصبحت يعني المعرضة للإرهاب بدلاً من أن تكون هي التي تدافع عن هذه الآفة وتحميها. شكراً للأخ الرئيس.
شكراً. الكلمة لسعادة النائبة رينا دورو من اليونان.
Thank you, dear President, distinguished colleagues. As we just heard, although we tackling and coping with the role of women in preventing terrorism, this moment, these hours that now we are discussing for this radical issue, a lot of women in Gaza, in Yemen, and everywhere are victims of terrorism, and this is something for which we have to mention in our session. For too long, still today, women have been perceived primarily as victims, displaced, targeted, and left to rebuild shattered communities. This suffering is real and must never be minimized, yet it is not the whole story. Across region and culture, women have proven to be powerful agents of change. They build resilience, counter extremist narratives, and reinforce the social trust upon which lasting peace demands. Women stand at the care of families and communities. They are often the first to detect early signs of radicalization. They are educators, sharing values, community leaders, fostering dialogue and tolerance, and citizens working, often quietly but effectively, to prevent the spread of violent ideologies. When women participate equally in decision-making processes at the local, national, and international level, our collective capacity to prevent violent extremism is significantly strengthening. Empowering women through education and economic opportunity further enhances resilience against extremist recruitment and reinforces positive social norms. Despite this evidence, women remain underrepresented in counter-terrorism and PCV policy formulation and implementation. This gap demands action. Integrating women into national and regional strategies is not a symbolic gesture. It is a strategic necessity. We must also invest in women-led organizations operating at the community level. This organization possesses deep local knowledge and trust that institutions alone cannot easily replicate. Finally, strong cooperation between parliamentarians, civil society, and international bodies is essential. Through collaboration, we exchange best practices, coordinate our efforts, and amplify the voices of women already making a difference. Dear colleagues, the fight against terrorism and violent extremism is not solely a matter of security. It is a matter of safeguarding our shared values, dignity, equality, and peace. Empower women strengthens the democratic foundation of our society. Let this session serve as a clear call to action to ensure that women are not only beneficiaries of peace, but its architects, not voices at the margin, but leaders at the very center of global counterterrorism and PCV efforts. Thank you.
شكرا. المرأة قائدة لجهود مكافحة الإرهاب. الكلمة لسعادة النائبة فدوى محسن الحيانة من المغرب.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. أصحاب المعالي والسعادة، السيدات والسادة، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله تعالى وبركاته. أود بداية أن أعبر عن سعادتي بانعقاد هذا الاجتماع وأن أشكركم على حسن اختيار موضوع دور المرأة في مكافحة الإرهاب ومنع ومكافحة التطرف العنيف الذي يعالج قضية بالغة الأهمية لما لها من انعكاس على أمن واستقرار المجتمع ككل. سيدات والسادة، يعتبر دور المرأة في محاربة التطرف والإرهاب وهو ما يستدعي في إشراك النساء في صنع القرار الأمني، فالاعتماد على المرأة يتيح إمكانية التكامل بين مختلف الأبعاد سواء الوجداني والتربوي والثقافي والاجتماعي والاقتصادي. السيدات والسادة، إن إدماج النساء أمر حاسم للمجتمعات ويسرع الانطلاقة الاقتصادية والاجتماعية، فالتجربة تبين أن المرأة تساهم بشكل مهم في تحديد مؤشرات التطرف واستكشاف علاماته الأولى، وبالتالي وجب التركيز على دور النساء في مكافحة التطرف والإرهاب. وفي هذا الصدد لا بد أن أذكر أن المغرب لديه تجربة كبيرة في مجال مكافحة التطرف والإرهاب، ويمكن أن يتقاسم هذه التجربة مع الجميع خاصة في مجال التعليم الديني. لقد اختار المغرب مقاربة شمولية ومتوازنة في مواجهة هذه الظاهرة تقوم على الوقاية والتأطير الديني المعتدل والتنمية البشرية واحترام حقوق الإنسان، مع إيلاء أهمية خاصة لدور المرأة باعتبارها فاعلاً أساسياً وترسيخ قيم السلم والتسامح داخل الأسرة والمجتمع. فقد لعب المغرب دوراً كبيراً في مواجهة التطرف عن طريق العديد من المبادرات التي تهدف إلى توعية الشباب وتقليل التطرف في أوساطهم. ومن بين هذه المبادرات نذكر تأسيس معهد محمد السادس لتكوين الأئمة والمرشدين والمرشدات من أجل التركيز على تدريب الأئمة خصوصاً من النساء للعمل في مجال الإرشاد الديني. وفي الأخير لابد أن أشير إلى أن البرلمان المغربي يقوم بدور أساسي في دعم الإطار التشريعي والمؤسساتي وتعزيز التعاون الدولي ولا سيما البرلماني من أجل تبادل الخبرات وأفضل الممارسات في مجال منع ومكافحة التطرف العنيف، مع التأكيد على احترام حقوق الإنسان وسيادة القانون. شكرا سيد الرئيس.
شكرا. الكلمة للدكتور معز دريد، هو المدير الإقليمي للدول العربية بهيئة الأمم المتحدة للمرأة.
شكرا سيدي الرئيس. وهنتقل للإنجليزية. To complement the moral and rights-based arguments of the esteemed previous speakers, I would like to relay research findings and empirical data that show that women's empowerment and ending violence against women are not only human rights and do not only make all the socio-economic sense, but when talking about preventing and countering violent extremism, women's empowerment and ending violence against women are making all the security sense. So statistical empirical data to show that they make all the security sense. UN Women, with national governments and with support from the United Kingdom, conducted research across North Africa. And it was the first and largest in scope back in 2019 and to date. And it has shed light on the link between the status of women and violent extremism. For example, in Libya, we found that hostile sexist attitudes towards women and support for violence against women are the factors most strongly associated with support for violent extremism. And this is based on survey research. So the probability that a person would support or be involved in violent extremism is correlated most not to the level of income or education of that person or to their geographical location, but to their attitudes and behavior towards women, including towards violence against women. And this research is available to all of you, to all parliamentarians, to inform your drive and championing of women's rights. Thank you very much.
شكرا. الكلمة لسعادة النائبة من تركيا.
Thank you very much. Esteemed participants, today terrorism and violent extremism have evolved into a complex structure that transcends national borders and threatens our collective security. Combating this threat necessitates not only a military and security-oriented approach, but also a sociological, economic, and inclusive strategy. Terrorism is the common enemy of humanity, regardless of religion, language, race, or geography. However, regrettably, radicalization processes and the spiral of violence mostly target women and children, who are the pillars of the social structure. As a country that has been fighting simultaneously against various terrorist organizations for decades, Turkey has a painful experience in this regard. However, this experience has shown us that the fight against terror can be won not only through security measures, but through social resilience, and women are at the forefront of this resilience. Indeed, the strategic role of women, who are the cornerstone of society in countering terrorism and preventing violent extremism, is not a choice, but the fundamental key to success. As Turkey, we strive to address this process in a multidimensional manner, not only through security measures, but also through social support, psychological counseling, education, and family-centered interventions. Policies developed especially for the education of women and girls, their protection from exploitation, and their active participation in society constitute a strong shield in preventing radicalization. On the other hand, utilizing the transformative power of women within the family against terrorist organization is another important method in preventing radicalization. Considering their position as caregivers within the family and the relational closeness this provides, the critical role of mothers becomes even more prominent. It is undoubted that raising awareness among families and especially mothers within the scope of combating radicalization and increasing state-family cooperation will make recruitment by terrorist organizations more difficult. Distinguished colleagues, I would like to emphasize once again that lasting success in the fight against violent extremism is possible only by positioning women not merely as victims, but as an active part of the solution and pioneers of change. The duty falling upon us as parliamentarians is to amplify the voice of women, to place them at the center of policymaking processes, and to deepen international cooperation in this field. As I conclude my remarks, I condemn all forms of terrorism and hope that women who represent the language of peace, love, and compassion will transform the Mediterranean into a basin of peace. Thank you very much.
شكرا جزيلا. الكلمة لسعادة النائبة إيما أختار عضو الجمعية الوطنية الباكستانية. باكستان.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Assalamu alaikum. A very good day to everyone. Excellencies, distinguished guests, eminent participants. Thank you so much for giving me an opportunity to speak at this forum. And it is a very important subject or theme for this session, which I definitely wanted to contribute in. Needless to get into the significance of the role of women and how they are disadvantagedly affected by conflict, and there are various sorts of conflicts that exist around the world. But Excellencies, I would just like, keeping the paucity of time in my view, I would just like to point out 2-3 issues. The women peace and security agenda that needs to be advanced keeps advancing, but there keeps coming up emerging issues and challenges. And they also are rooted in a couple of main issues. First is that, yes, we all recognize that women are disadvantagedly and are, not only victims of terrorism, conflict, but also are facilitators of violence and conflict around the globe, and we have empirical evidence for that. We also see that there is a growing understanding of need to implement Security Council resolutions like 1325 and the following resolutions that came up, each one signifying the different perspectives. I would not further dilate on this, but I would like to state that while understanding the need for doing something about and advancing and proceeding over the women, peace and security agenda, we have to design strategies to actually include women in peace processes. We see them not being there. Over-militarization of conflict is again an issue which keeps women out of the negotiations and processes. And we also see that now, there are different perspectives of conflict which include digitalization, and that is again a huge challenge. So when we are talking about this, and seeing that most of us over here are parliamentarians and people's representatives and policymakers and lawmakers, we need to join hands and we need to definitely put forward our own contribution. I will not ask what should we do. It is, I need to present the recommendations as a parliamentarian. And I think we need to join hands. We need to make some very concrete efforts to include women in peace processes, which include the designing, the discussions, the negotiations, the policy making and the law making, and ensuring women are part of that with a meaningful role, not women who have no idea, because many of us have no idea what it is all about, what it entails, you know, what are the consequences, and what is the futuristic approach towards designing these policies and lawmaking. So we have to have some vision around it. And I think that this is a great forum that where we can join hands and do some strategic action plans for the countries, and they can adapt, because we also need to contextualize. It is very important that we contextualize our issues. Pakistan, for instance, has a very geopolitical, has been in conflict lately, and you have all seen. And same goes, if we look at the Africa, we get very positive results from women's, you know, like involvement in peace process and waging war and, you know, striking peace and having stability. So these are, you know, I don't want to go further on that given the paucity of time, but these are my recommendations, Excellencies, that we need to do something very appropriately, strategically and effectively from this forum, which the countries, member countries, the observers are able to follow. My submission. Thank you very much.
شكرا للسيدة النائبة فعلا يدا بيد من أجل توصيات تسهم في دعم وتواجد المرأة بشكل فعال على كل المستويات. إذن كل هذه التدخلات ستكون محور توصيات هذا المنتدى، باعتبار أن هذه الجلسة كانت غنية ومهمة، لأن دور المرأة في مكافحة الإرهاب والوقاية من التطرف ومكافحته يعتبر من المواضيع ذات الأهمية وذات الأولوية. لذلك أشكر كل المتدخلين والمتدخلات، أشكر إيشلي وليما وكذلك التدخلات عن بعد. وننتقل من جلسة محورية عامة إلى جلسة خاصة، وهي الجلسة الرابعة في موضوع العنف الجنسي والتمييز الجنسي المرتبط بالإرهاب. وأدعو سعادة السيدة سارة في الكناز مقررة لجنة الدفاع والداخلية والشؤون الخارجية لتسيير هذه الجلسة. شكرا لكم جميعا.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Good afternoon, basically, to everyone here. Excellencies, distinguished guests, dear colleagues, it's a privilege to welcome you all to the Federal National Council in Abu Dhabi for the second day of our forum. We are deeply honored that the second session of the PAM Women Parliamentary Forum is held under the high patronage of Her Highness Sheikha Fatma bint Mbarak, Mother of the Nation, President of the General Women's Union, and global beacon for the empowerment of women and children. Her Highness's vision for a cohesive and inclusive society is the foundation of our discussions today. As the Rapporteur of Defense, Interior and Foreign Affairs Committee, I am proud to moderate Session 4, Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Linked to Terrorism. In the UAE, we believe that peace and security are inseparable from the dignity and protection of women. Today, we address a dark reality of modern conflict with the aim of building a more resilient and protected future. The UAE has always championed the role of regional cooperation in overcoming shared challenges. To provide a perspective from West Africa, I am honored to invite Her Excellency Senator Fanny Moussoukoura Chantal, Vice President of the Senate of Republic of Cote d'Ivoire and President of the ECOWAS Female Parliamentarian Association. Senator, your presence reinforces the bridge we are building from the Gulf to the Mediterranean and beyond. Please, the floor is yours.
Allô? OK. Honorable Président de l'Assemblée parlementaire méditerranéenne, Sénateur Sarah Falakant, distingués membres du Parlement, chers collègues, Mesdames et Messieurs, je viens d'Afrique de l'Ouest, d'une région profondément marquée par les mutations politiques, le terrorisme et les fragilités sociales. Dans nos pays et particulièrement dans le Sahel et le bassin du lac du Tchad, du Mali au Burkina Faso, du Niger au nord du Nigeria, la violence est devenue une réalité quotidienne pour les familles, les marchés, les écoles et les diasporas. Dans ce contexte, nous observons une tendance de plus en plus documentée par les Nations Unies. L'utilisation de la violence sexuelle et sexiste comme tactique de guerre, de punition et de terrorisme. Elle vise le corps des femmes, mais en réalité, elle attaque l'honneur des communautés, la cohésion des familles et la stabilité des nations. En Afrique de l'Ouest, cela n'a pas une abstraction, c'est un vécu. Au Nigeria, l'insurrection de Boko Haram a utilisé l'enlèvement, le mariage forcé, la grossesse imposée et l'esclavage sexuel comme instrument de domination. Au Burkina Faso, dans le cadre des insurrections terroristes, des femmes, des jeunes filles ont été prises pour cible, déplacées, enlevées, utilisées comme outil de pression sur les communautés. Au Libéria, la guerre civile a systématisé la violence sexuelle comme stratégie d'humiliation et de destruction sociale. Et en Côte d'Ivoire, mon propre pays, les crises politico-militaires ont également exposé les femmes à des violences sexuelles liées aux conflits et aux fractures politiques, notamment dans l'ouest du pays. Ces réalités montrent que la violence sexuelle n'est pas un dommage collatéral du terrorisme ou des conflits. C'est une tactique. Face à ces défis, nos institutions politiques évoluent. En Côte d'Ivoire, l'institution parlementaire qui comprend l'Assemblée nationale et le Sénat est pour la première fois présidée par une femme à la tête de l'une de ses chambres, Son Excellence Madame Kandia Kamisoko Kamara, présidente du Sénat. Dans nos régions, d'autres progrès ont été accomplis. Au Togo, l'Assemblée nationale a été présidée par une femme, créant ainsi un précédent important dans l'histoire parlementaire de la CEDEAO. Et aujourd'hui, au niveau régional, c'est une femme, Madame Meminatou Ibrahima, qui préside le Parlement de la CEDEAO. Un fait institutionnel majeur, porteur d'espoir et de projection. Ces avancées nationales et régionales témoignent d'une dynamique réelle, la féminisation progressive des institutions de gouvernance dans l'espace CEDEAO, mais elles montrent aussi que nous pouvons et nous devons aller plus loin. Car des institutions dirigées ou influencées par des femmes sont mieux à même de dialoguer avec les cadres multilatéraux internationaux, qu'il s'agisse de la résolution 1325 du Conseil de sécurité de l'ONU Femmes, de l'architecture Femmes, Paix et Sécurité ou de forums parlementaires tels que la PAM, où nous sommes réunis aujourd'hui. Cette articulation entre nationale, régionale et multilatérale est essentielle. Elle crée un environnement propice à la législation, à la médiatisation et à la protection. Elle montre que la progression féminine au sein des structures de gouvernement n'est pas seulement symbolique. Elle améliore la capacité de nos parlements à prévenir, à stabiliser et à reconstruire. Une autre bataille silencieuse se joue déjà, celle du Next Gen féminin. Les jeunes filles qui étudient aujourd'hui à Abidjan, Lagos, Dakar ou Lomé, mais aussi à Paris, Londres ou New York, au sein de grandes diasporas africaines, seront demain les parlementaires, les diplomates, les médiatrices et les ministres de l'Afrique de l'Ouest. Et si nous échouons à les préparer, nous laisserons nos pays sans héritière de la stabilité. Or, une paix sans héritière est une paix fragile. Je crois profondément qu'il existe un lien stratégique entre l'Afrique de l'Ouest, le Golfe et la Méditerranée. Nos histoires ne sont pas les mêmes, mais nos défis le sont. La sécurité, l'éducation, la cohésion sociale, la participation des femmes et la transmission du leadership. Dans ce contexte, les parlements peuvent devenir des ponts de dialogue entre les nations, les producteurs de résilience dans les moments de crise et les gardiens de la dignité. Permettez-moi de conclure avec une conviction simple. Une femme n'est pas seulement bénéficiaire de la paix, elle est souvent la condition. Et en Afrique de l'Ouest, nous avons appris une vérité dure mais précieuse. Là où les femmes tiennent, les sociétés ne s'effondrent pas. Avec respect et solidarité, je vous remercie. Thank you. Obrigado. Shukran. Jaxelan.
Thank you, Senator. We now turn to a segment that requires our utmost attention and empathy. I welcome Ms. Valentina Bernasconi, head of the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC delegation in the UAE. The ICRC is a vital partner in our humanitarian mission, and we look forward to your insights on protecting the vulnerable in the field.
Thank you, Excellency. Assalamu alaikum, Excellencies, distinguished members. Let me first thank the organizer for associating the ICRC to such an important panel of discussions. And I also would like to take the opportunity to thank the translators that we don't really see, but they really help the communication flow on such important topics as the one that we've been discussing over the past 2 days. Before addressing the issue of gender-based violence, I would like to take a short moment to clarify the legal framework in which the International Committee of the Red Cross operates as an impartial, humanitarian, and neutral actor. Our mandate is anchored in the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949 and their additional protocols, which basically entrust the ICRC to a specific humanitarian task, which is the one to protect and assist the victim of conflict, in conflict and in other situations of violence. So where is the link here with terrorism? Actually, the link is double. First of all, IHL does not provide a definition of terrorism. However, in all the bodies of the international humanitarian law, we see that there is a prohibition of measures of terrorism and acts of terrorism. So I will not go through all of the articles of IHL, of course, but just to cite one, the additional protocols of the 4 Geneva Conventions, they mention acts or threats of violence, the primary purpose of which is to spread terror among the civilian population, are prohibited. The second link between our legal framework and terrorism is that where we operate, we witness more and more an increase of state to implement counterterrorism or preventing violent extremism and counterterrorism measures. So we operate under the framework of IHL. However, there is an overlap with measures against or preventing terrorism. Another thing that we witness where we operate is that there is an increased attention, I would say, on women and terrorism. There was an interesting study that was published in 2021 analyzing all the literature that came out between 1970 and 2021 on women and terrorism. And according to this study, 2 trends are highlighted. One is that there is an increased attention on the role of women in terrorist acts. But the second one, which is the one that interests most us as humanitarian responders, is how terrorism impacts particularly women. ICRC does not consider gender-based violence as a typical trait or as a defining feature of terrorism as such. We look more into the patterns of violence within armed conflict and other situations of violence. And what we acknowledged is that gender-based violence frequently occur in the context of conflict, and they involve a variety of armed carriers. And among these armed carriers, also non-state armed carriers, no matter how they are labeled by the states themselves. As we know, gender-based violence includes sexual violence, and we see that this specific type of violence in the context where we operate is not typical of a conflict, is not typical of a region, is not typical of a culture. Sexual violence occurs everywhere. It occurred throughout history and on all continents. And that's why the ICRC in 2014 decided to make sexual violence one of its institutional priorities, expanding its effort to address sexual violence in armed conflicts and other situations of violence, with a focus on preventing and not just responding to sexual violence. Why so? Because we consider sexual violence as a silent crime. We see more and more women in a context of conflict willing to speak about sexual violence, willing to seek support for sexual violence. However, when you're in a conflict, access to what you need, it's disrupted. We see that, for example, hospitals are destroyed. We see that medical personnel is targeted. And we see also that access to basic needs such as water or food are not guaranteed because of the conflict. So in The 130 armed conflicts that are active in the world today, which is, by the way, twice as much as we saw 15 years ago, as ICRC frontliner organization, we see a disproportionate toll of armed conflict on women and girls because simply the rules of war that should apply are not respected. And conflicts, they do affect women in a very specific and unique way. Fear is a big consequence on women. We also have the loss of the loved ones, putting women to take a different role as the one that they've been carrying out before conflict into the society. And when it comes specifically to sexual violence, it's even worse because it can be used as an insidious tactic in war, seeding trauma that reverberates not only to the victim herself or himself, but also throughout generations. So how we ensure that we can assist and protect women in war and other situations of violence when it comes to gender-based violence? Well, first of all, we adopt a response that is deliberately practical and discreet, and most of all, survivor-centered. Why so? Because often with gender-based violence come stigma. They go hand in hand, unfortunately. So we avoid to have standalone programs or visible programs, but we integrate this response in our broader protection approach. Also promoting prevention into the disseminations and trainings that we carried out at operational level with all the armed carriers and weapon bearers. We prioritize the confidentiality so that we ensure that the survivor can seek help safely. We also support medical care, not just in the form of emergency response, but also in terms of psychological support, which is something much needed. And this is a field where we also see women getting more and more active to work in. And lastly, we ensure access to water, sanitation, shelter, and also food distribution when possible to reduce exposure to violence. Today and also yesterday, we've been hearing a lot of agreement on the fact that women needs must be addressed, that terrorism must be addressed as a priority, and there is a consensus on that, but there is less consensus on how we need to do so. There are various legal frameworks, multiple UN Security Council resolutions, and a wide range of national laws. So this is good, and we join the states as ICRC in that. In this, we have a common objective. We share this common objective of stopping deliberate killing and injuring and terrorizing civilians in armed conflicts. However, PVE, CVE, and counterterrorism measures, they have a political goal which differs sometimes from the humanitarian intent of an impartial and neutral organization like the ICRC. So we respect the need for states to take counterterrorism measures, but I would like to drag your attention on two challenges that we face when in this framework of overlapping between IHL and terrorism or counterterrorism measures we operate. And these two challenges are the legal frameworks and the operational limitations. When legal frameworks for counterterrorism are put in place, although we are frontliners and we are in the context and we are the one talking directly to the victims of gender-based violence, we are not necessarily taken into the conversation to design these measures. Terrorism laws are becoming tougher and they are more wide-sweeping around the globe, and sometimes ICRC struggle to share the best practices that we see in multiple contexts. The other challenge that we have is the operational limitation. We heard before that legal frameworks are not enough. So there is also a need of a neutral, independent, and impartial humanitarian action to address the needs that stem from violence such as sexual violence. And to do that, it's also important that states keep in mind when designing laws and legal frameworks to distinguish humanitarian actors from being associated with groups labeled as terrorists, because our ultimate goal is really to reach the one in need, and to do so, as it is given by our mandate, we need to talk to all parties to the conflict, to all weapon bearers, to make sure that we can reach the ones in need. I will conclude by maybe looking into what we can do collectively to ensure that victims of gender-based violence and sexual violence in situation of conflicts can be assisted. Yesterday, President Cementero underlined the need to ensure that women and girls in conflict get access to protection, and he also underlined the need to reduce and prevent violence against women and girls in conflict. I think that we need to be conscious, all of us, that tools are already there. International humanitarian law already prohibits acts or threats of violence whose primary purpose is to spread terror among the civilian population. So collectively, I think we can really contribute to build up an environment that is favorable to the respect of IHL and the humanitarian action. And on this, I want to salute the UAE specifically, because in 2024, the International Committee of the ICRC launched, together with Brazil, France, China, Jordan, Kazakhstan, and South Africa, an initiative which is called the Global Initiative for Humanitarian Law, to strengthen the compliance to IHL. And the UAE joined this initiative. They were among the first ones to join this initiative last year, and they are now co-chairing the work stream on prevention. So we deeply value the UAE constructive role in this initiative, and because this type of initiative is central to addressing some of the most serious violations of IHLs that we witness in conflict, one of them being gender-based violence and sexual violence. So looking ahead, I think it is important that as parliamentarians, you support the promotion, the integration of IHL, including reinforcing preventive measures within military doctrines and trainings, pushing for a more integrated protection against sexual violence into national legislation and operational planning, and then ensure accountability mechanism for violations and safeguarding of humanitarian access and survivors without discrimination.
Can you please
Thank
conclude?
you.
Oh, all right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ms. Valentina. I now invite our delegates to engage in an open discussion. Let us focus our interventions on how we can translate these insights into legislative action and regional policy. I would like to note, please, that you have a limit to 1 minute, please. Kindly limit your intervention to 1 minute. So we will start our intervention with Honorable Sally Morati from North Macedonia, followed by Honorable Vivian Teitelbaum.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Kıymetli hazirun, değerli katılımcılar, Makedonya Meclisi PAM Heyet Başkanı ve heyetim adına başta ev sahipliğin misafirperverliğine ve tüm katılımcılara saygıyla selamlıyorum. Değerli meslektaşlarım, güvenlik yalnızca cesaret meselesi değil, ortak sorumluluktur. Makedonya Cumhuriyeti olarak şu inancı taşıyoruz: kadınların terörizme ve şiddete karşı mücadeleye katılımı sal bir eşitlik değil, etkinlik ve sonuç meselesidir. İzin verirseniz somut olarak sizlere şunları paylaşmak isterim. Makedonya Cumhuriyeti bölgede öncü konumdadır bu konuda. 2024 yılında itibaren Savunma Bakanlığımız, Birleşmiş Milletler'in terörizme karşı mücadele parlamento meclisleri koordinasyon mekanizmasında başkanlık etmektedir ve yürütmektedir. İkincisi, silahlı kuvvetlerimizde kadın oranı 2024'te %12'ye ulaşmış bulunmakta. Subay kadromuzda kadın oranı ise %22 yükselmiştir. Yine güvenlik toplumsal cinsiyet boyutları konusunda aktif eğitim veren 27 sertifikalı uzmanlarımızdan büyük bir bölümü kadınlardan oluşmaktadır. Bu bağlamda Savunma Bakanlığımız ve Silahlı Kuvvetlerimizde Cenevre Güvenlik Sektör Yönetimi Merkezi ile işbirliğimizin kapsamında toplumsal cinsiyet değerlendirilmesi gerçekleştirmiştir. Bunun doğrudan sonuç olarak
Your Excellency, can you please conclude?
2024-2028 toplumsal cinsiyet eşitliği eylem planımız hayata geçmiştir. Sonuç olarak bizler 2. Ulusal Eylem Planımızla etkin şekilde yürütmekteyiz. Bakanlıklar arası danışma grubunu düzenli 6 aylık raporlar yapmakta ve bu bağlamda kadın personel değişik misyonlarımıza göndermekteyiz. Örnek olarak 2024'te NATO daimi delegasyonumuzda 2 kadın, AGİT misyonumuzda 1 kadın yer almaktadır. Sonuç olarak kadınlar güvenliğini yalnızca alıcı değil, yaratıcılığını ihtiyacımız vardır. Onlar alan, eğitim ve yetki verdiğimizde daha güçlü ve direnişçi toplumlar inşa ederiz. Esselamun Aleyküm ve Rahmetullahi ve Berekatuhu.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Now the floor is for Honorable Vivian Teitelbaum from Assemblée Parlementaire de la Francophonie, APF. And I apologize for mispronouncing your names, if I may.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente. C'était parfait. Et très rapidement, je voudrais rappeler que le réseau des femmes parlementaires de l'APF, que j'ai l'honneur de présider, accorde une attention transversale et constante à la problématique des violences sexuelles et sexistes liées au terrorisme. À ce titre, nous avons d'ailleurs récemment organisé 2 séminaires de formation à destination des parlementaires et des fonctionnaires parlementaires consacrés à la résolution 1325, Femmes, Paix et Sécurité, et à la mise en œuvre des plans nationaux en Serbie et au Sénégal. Cela passe pour nous par l'adoption de cadres juridiques adaptés, la protection des victimes et la lutte résolue contre l'impunité des auteurs, car le viol n'est pas un dommage collatéral du terrorisme. C'est une arme stratégique pensée pour terroriser, pour briser et dominer. Chaque fois que le viol est ignoré, minimisé ou impuni, le terrorisme gagne une victoire supplémentaire sur l'état de droit, car à travers le viol et les violences, c'est la société tout entière qui est visée. Accroître la représentation des femmes dans les instances de décision parlementaire n'est donc pas un symbole, mais un levier concret pour améliorer la prévention, la prise en charge des victimes et l'efficacité des politiques publiques. Plus spécifiquement, en tant que femmes parlementaires, nous avons la responsabilité de promouvoir des lois reconnaissant explicitement le viol et les violences sexuelles comme des outils de terrorisme et de guerre, afin de renforcer les poursuites pénales et l'accès à la justice pour les victimes. En conclusion, la lutte contre les violences sexuelles et sexistes liées au terrorisme est une exigence de justice et de respect des droits humains. C'est
Your
un devoir...
Excellency, can you please conclude?
Yes, I'm concluding. C'est un devoir parlementaire que de porter la voix des plus vulnérables et de garantir que l'État protège toutes les personnes, sans exception. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Your Excellency. My dear fellow colleagues, Your Excellency, and distinguished guests, it's not nice, I know that, to stop you, but because we are really behind schedule. So therefore, can you please limit your interventions to 1 minute. I now give the floor to Honorable Giovanna Trenchevska from North Macedonia. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Sexual and gender-based violence linked to terrorism is a serious and complex security challenge, as well as a serious human rights issue, which most often disproportionately affects women, girls, and children in general in conflict in post-conflict settings. In my country, there are no direct cases of sexual and gender-based violence connected to terrorism, but gender-based violence is still a serious issue. Almost half of women have experienced some form of violence after the age of 15. More than 60% of women have faced online gender-based violence, and most of these cases are never reported. As a country, we have positive development. Important steps were taken to deal with this problem. This includes legal reforms, training for police officers, social workers, and programs that support women who have survive violence. When women are supported and empowered, families become healthier, communities become stronger, and society becomes safer for everyone. In conclusion, every investment in the protection, education, and support of women is an investment in a stronger and fair society. With continued effort, we can build a society where violence is not
Your
accepted
Excellency,
and
can you
where
please conclude?
equality and dignity are respected. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. You're so kind. Now I invite Honorable Ibtisam Al-Dallal, member of delegation of the Arab Parliament. Well, she's not here, so now I move on to Honorable Rina Duro from Greece.
Thank you. Madam Chair, following your request, I will focus strictly on legislative and policy implication for just 1 minute. At a time when sexual and gender-based violence is increasing globally, the Istanbul Convention remains the most comprehensive international legal instrument for the protection of women. It's firmly anchored in international law and fully aligned with the United Nations Framework on Human Rights and Women, Peace and Security. Against this background, the withdrawal of several countries, for example, Turkey, from the Istanbul Convention is deeply troubling. Let us be clear, stepping away from this convention is not a technical or internal choice. It represents a deliberate distancing from international law and from the normative legality of the United Nations. Such action weaken accountability, undermine protection, and normalize impunity. For parliamentarians, the responsibility is clear. International frameworks exist to protect when national systems fail. Abandoning them means abandoning women and girls when they need protection most. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for concluding on time. Now we go to our last intervention with Her Excellency Honorable Lulwa Al-Rumehi from Bahrain. The floor is yours.
الزميلات والزملاء الكرام، السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. يشرفني أن أشارك في هذه الجلسة التي تتناول أحد أخطر الأبعاد المرتبطة بظاهرة الإرهاب، وهو العنف القائم على النوع الاجتماعي بما يحمله من تداعيات إنسانية وأمنية واجتماعية لا تقف عند حدود الضحايا المباشرين، بل تمتد لتطال تماسك المجتمعات واستقرارها، ولا سيما في منطقتنا الأورو متوسطية والخليجية. لقد بات واضحاً أن الجماعات الإرهابية والمتطرفة توظف القائم على النوع الاجتماعي كوسيلة ممنهجة لفرض السيطرة وتقويض النسيج الاجتماعي وتقويض الحقوق الأساسية، ويتخذ هذا العنف أشكالاً متعددة لا تهدف فقط إلى الإيذاء المباشر، بل كسر الإرادة وزعزعة الثقة المجتمعية وتعطيل الدور الحيوي للأسرة والمجتمع. وغالباً ما يغلف بخطاب زائف يدعي مشروعية دينية أو ثقافية لا تمت للقيم الإنسانية بصلة. ومن هذا المنطلق فإن التصدي لهذا النوع من العنف لا يمكن أن يختزل في المقاربات الأمنية وحدها، بل يتطلب مقاربة شاملة ومتكاملة.
لو تختمين إذا ما عليك أمر.
إن شاء الله. تشمل التشريع والحماية المجتمعية والتعليم وتمكين المرأة في مختلف مستويات صنع القرار. فالمرأة في هذا السياق ليست مجرد ضحية، بل عنصر فاعل في الوقاية وإعادة البناء وتعزيز السلم المجتمعي. شكراً. مع السلامة.
يعطيك العافية، مشكورة. Excellencies, this concludes our session. Before we transition, I would like to invite His Excellency Mr. Martin Chongong, Secretary General of the International Parliamentary Union, to share his remarks on the future of Women Fora. Thank you very much.
It's no way. Can you hear me? Thank you very much, Madam Chair, Sarah. I have the pleasure of saying a few words here. And Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, let me first of all appreciate the United Arab Emirates, its Federal National Council, for hosting us here in Abu Dhabi. And I want to acknowledge with profound respect Her Highness Sheikha Fatima bin Mubarak for her leadership in fostering dialogue and advancing gender equality. I also wish to thank the Parliamentary Assembly of the Mediterranean for bringing us together, and the PAM Women's Parliamentary Forum for convening this timely dialogue at a moment when cohesion, inclusion, and leadership matter more than ever. Sometimes it's challenging to take the floor at the tail end of a meeting, a conference like this one, because virtually everything has been said. But the beauty of it is I can all the time say I agree with everything that has been said. And sometimes when we do repeat, it is because we want to reinforce the messages that have been articulated here. And that's why today, as I make my remarks, I want to draw attention to a number of key points that have been made during this conference with which we agree, which resonate very well with the mandate of the Inter-Parliamentary Union. First of all, as we gather here, the world is more fragmented and uncertain than at any time in recent memory. In such moments, it can feel tempting to retreat into what is familiar, what is immediate, what seems controllable. But this is precisely when multilateralism matters the most, as the essential space where we keep channels open, manage differences, and build societies or solutions that no country can secure alone. That conviction is in the DNA of the Inter-Parliamentary Union. The IPU was created in 1889 as the first political organization for global dialogue. It was born from a simple but enduring idea. Even when positions change or diverge, dialogue must remain possible. Today, the IPU brings together 183 member parliaments and 15 associate members. As the world's organization of parliaments, our mission remains the same: to make dialogue possible at all times and to make it consequential. And this is where parliamentary diplomacy matters so deeply. When executive channels freeze, parliaments can still speak. When traditional channels harden, legislators can still listen. Parliamentary diplomacy offers alternative pathways beyond party lines, beyond borders. It is a safeguard for dialogue when dialogue is most at risk. So when we ask, what is the future of women fora, we're also asking what kind of multilateralism will endure in an era of fragmentation. Because cohesion and inclusion do not happen by accident. They are built rule by rule, culture by culture, and gender equality in decision-making is first and foremost a matter of rights. At the same time, it is also a governance imperative. The point has been made here today and yesterday that when half the population is not fully represented, institutions lose legitimacy and become less resilient. Looking at the facts, let's just remind ourselves that women now make up just over 27% of parliamentarians worldwide. In leadership positions, the gap remains even more stark. Women hold about 1 in 5 speakers posts globally. There has been progress granted from 11.3% of women MPs in 1995 to 27.2% today. But we should also be clear-eyed. In recent years, progress has stagnated. 2024 brought only a 0.3 percentage point increase globally, the slowest rate since 2017. When it comes to the women, peace and security agenda, as we have heard, women's leadership appears all the more crucial. UN Women data shows that women's participation in peace processes increases the probability of an agreement lasting at least 2 years by 20% and lasting 15 years by 35%. This is about the durability of peace itself. But the reality is striking. In 2024, women made up only 7% of negotiators on average worldwide, and nearly 9 out of 10 negotiation tracks included no women negotiators at all. 2/3 of mediation efforts did not include any women mediator. Against this drop, the message is simple. Gains are not self-sustaining. They require leadership, institutions that deliver, and spaces that keep ambition alive and translate it into change. That is precisely why women's fora are not side meetings. They are engines of democratic renewal. At the Inter-Parliamentary Union, our experience is indicative of what women's fora can achieve over time. As the IPU president said yesterday, in 2025, the IPU Forum of Women Parliamentarians marks its 40th anniversary of existence. Over 4 decades, the forum has provided a space for empowerment, solidarity, and impact. It has contributed in practical ways to shaping the IPU's priorities and working culture, helping ensure that gender equality is reflected increasingly in our day-to-day practices and decisions. And we have learned something important. A forum becomes transformative when it has 3 things. 1, a forum needs institutional influence, not symbolic space. To lead and inspire, women's fora must be connected to how decisions are made, so that gender equality is treated as a core measure of institutional legitimacy. At the Inter-Parliamentary Union, we have chosen to be explicit so that inclusion is not left to goodwill. Our statutes and rules require mainstreaming a gender perspective in all our work. They are couched in a way as to foster gender-based representation in our structures with the ultimate goal of overall 50-50 parity. And we have backed this commitment with concrete mechanisms. Under the same rules, if a delegation attends 2 consecutive assemblies composed exclusively of parliamentarians of the same sex, it faces voting penalties. 2, a forum needs safety. physical safety, and democratic safety. Women cannot lead if they are forced to navigate intimidation, harassment, and violence, whether in corridors, in meetings, or online. They also cannot lead if the space for debate becomes hostile, if speaking up carries a personal cost. This is not abstract. 4 IPU studies have documented what sexism, harassment, and violence against women in parliaments are disturbingly widespread. Between 80 and 85% of women MPs surveyed reported experiencing some form of psychological violence during their term of office. This must be met with zero tolerance, not as a slogan, but as a standard backed by rules, reporting mechanisms, and accountability. No woman should have to choose between public service and personal safety. And no space for dialogue can call itself democratic if intimidation is allowed to silence women's voices. This applies unequivocally to all women, from MPs to staff members and interns. I therefore just want to conclude by saying how proud we are to be able at the IPU to embody the virtues of gender equality, something that we are promoting on a daily basis. And let me also use the opportunity to draw attention to an initiative which we consider to be very crucial, and that is the IGC network, which is the International Gender Champions Network, and I'm privileged to be the chair of the global board of this initiative, which brings together heads of organizations, diplomats, civil society leaders, each in their field committed to promoting gender equality in business practices. We think that leadership comes from the top, and if we are able to make any progress, it is through ourselves embodying that gender equality that we aspire to. So we are very pleased as leaders to be able to drive the gender equality dossier, and I'm very pleased that today we are able to meet here in the United Arab Emirates, where we have men and women joining forces in order to undertake to promote gender equality in a more robust fashion. Of course, the IPU, as the global organization, the umbrella organization of parliaments, will continue to mobilize parliaments and their members in support of the noble objective of achieving gender equality, which is something that we need to do on a daily basis, because there's no room for complacency. Otherwise, as we have seen in recent years, there will be a rollback of progress that have been achieved over a period of time. So I conclude by conveying our message of solidarity to you all, and to state how pleased we will be to continue to work with our partners, including within the Parliamentary Assembly of the Mediterranean, so that we can achieve our noble objective of ensuring 50-50 parity in decision-making and, in fact, in women's empowerment worldwide. Thank you very much.
On behalf of PAM and all the delegates, and on my own, I wish to offer to Martin this as a symbol of eternal friendship and gratitude.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Wow.
Thank you, Martin.
Thank you, Sergio.
You're a great man. Distinguished delegate, just a few minutes we are waiting for His Excellency, Mr. Speaker, to join us. Thank you.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نبدأ معكم الآن الخلاصة وخارطة الطريق المستقبلية لمنتدى النساء البرلمانيات. خلال أعمال المنتدى أثمرت النقاشات عن نتائج مهمة وعملية، حيث استمعنا إلى أكثر من 20 خبيراً وبرلمانياً من مختلف دول وبرلمانات البحر الأبيض المتوسط. تبادلوا الرؤى والخبرات حول مجموعة من القضايا المحورية، أبرزها المشاركة الفاعلة والمتكافئة للنساء في البرلمانات والمؤسسات الحكومية، تمكين النساء اقتصادياً وضمان حقوقهن في العمل والأجر العادل والاستقلال المالي، التحديات الرقمية التي تواجه النساء بما في ذلك التضليل الإعلامي والعنف الإلكتروني وسوء استخدام التقنيات الناشئة والذكاء الاصطناعي، آثار التغير المناخي والتدهور البيئي على النساء لا سيما المناطق الريفية والهشة، قضايا النزاعات والإتجار بالبشر والعنف الجنسي المرتبط بالصراعات وما يترتب عليها من آثار متعددة الأجيال. وقد أكدت هذه النقاشات أن تمكين المرأة لم يعد قضية قطاعية بل ركيزة أساسية لتعزيز صمود المجتمعات والديمقراطيات. وانطلاقاً من هذه المداولات يسرني أن أستعرض معكم أولويات منتدى النساء البرلمانيات خلال الأعوام 2026-2027 والتي سترتكز على تعزيز المشاركة المتساوية للنساء داخل البرلمانات والمؤسسات السياسية باعتبارها عنصراً أساسياً في الحوكمة والديمقراطية الرشيدة، الاعتراف بالدور الاقتصادي والاجتماعي غير القابل للاستبدال الذي تقوم به النساء سواء داخل سوق العمل أو داخل الأسرة والمجتمع، سد الفجوات التي تعيق وصول النساء إلى سوق العمل والدفاع عن مبدأ الأجر المتساوي والوصول إلى التمويل وريادة الأعمال، التصدي للتضليل الإعلامي والعنف الرقمي وضمان بيئة رقمية أكثر أماناً للنساء والفتيات، دمج البعد الجندري في السياسات المناخية والبيئية وضمان وصول النساء في المناطق الريفية إلى الخدمات، إدماج منظور النوع الاجتماعي في السياسات المتعلقة بالنزاعات والإتجار بالبشر والعنف الجنسي المرتبط بها. وبناء على هذه الأولويات نرى أن خريطة الطريق للمرحلة المقبلة يجب أن ترتكز على نقطتين أساسيتين تشكلان الإطار العملي لتحويل هذه الرؤى إلى نتائج ملموسة. النقطة الأولى التي تتعلق بالتعديلات المؤسسية، حيث نقترح أن يتم الأخذ بمنظور منتدى النساء البرلمانيات بشكل منهجي في جميع القرارات والتوصيات الصادرة عن اللجان الدائمة لبرلمان البحر الأبيض المتوسط، ويهدف ذلك إلى ضمان إدماج البعد الجندري في السياسات والقرارات البرلمانية منذ مراحلها الأولى، تعزيز التنسيق بين المنتدى واللجان الدائمة بحيث يصبح المنتدى شريكاً فاعلاً في صياغة التوجهات البرلمانية الإقليمية، الانتقال من الطابع الاستشاري إلى التأثير المؤسسي المستدام. أما النقطة الثانية فهي تعزيز القدرات البرلمانية للنساء، وذلك من خلال مسارين متكاملين. أولاً، إنشاء وتفعيل المجلس الاستشاري لمنتدى النساء البرلمانيات ليكون منصة خبرات تضم برلمانيات وخبراء متخصصين تسهم في تقديم المشورة ودعم السياسات ومرافقة أعمال المنتدى على مدار العام. ثانياً، عقد سلسلة من الندوات الإلكترونية المنتظمة التي تركز على بناء قدرات البرلمانيات لا سيما في المجالات التالية: الدفاع عن حقوق النساء والفتيات، التشريعات الداعمة للتمكين الاقتصادي، التعامل مع التحديات الرقمية والإعلامية، وتبادل أفضل الممارسات البرلمانية بين الدول الأعضاء. وبهذا النهج نضمن أن يبقى المنتدى منصة عمل مستمرة لا تقتصر على اجتماع سنوي، بل تمتد آثارها العملية بين دورة وأخرى. كان هذا خارطة الطريق المستقبلية للمنتدى. وقبل أن نختم أعمال هذا المنتدى أود أن أتقدم بجزيل الشكر لجميع المشاركين والذين كانت لهم إضافة عظيمة نقول لهذا المنتدى، وكذلك خالص الشكر لرؤساء البرلمانات ونوابهم الذين شاركونا في هذا المنتدى، وعلى رأسهم معالي صقر غباش الداعم الدائم لمنتدى نساء البرلمانيات في جميع المجالات وليس فقط في هذا المنتدى ولكن في المشاركات الخارجية. معاليك لو تعطينا كلمة بسيطة. نعم لم نخبرك ولكن يعني سنكون سعيدين. شكرا.
بالبداية يعني لابد من الإشادة بما توصلتم له من خلال اللقاء اللي استمر على مدى يومين، وأكرر الحقيقة تقديري وامتناني وتقديرنا في الإمارات لحرص الجميع على المشاركة في هذا المنتدى وعلى ما توصلتم له كخارطة طريق في هذا الشأن. نحن في الإمارات نعتز بما وصلت إليه المرأة ورعاية سمو الشيخة فاطمة بنت مبارك لهذا المؤتمر، وباعتبارها النموذج الأكثر وضوحاً لنا في الإمارات وكذلك على المستوى العربي والعالمي، يؤكد أن المرأة شريك أساسي في التنمية، وأن التنمية لا يمكن أن تكون إلا على جناحين حتى تتمكن من النهوض. والمرأة ودورها الأساسي في الأسرة غاية في الأهمية، هي الحاضنة وهي بيت يتكون فيه الطفل ويشرب من والدته أو من والديه القيم وتنغرس فيه قيم المجتمع والقيم الإنسانية. ولهذا نرى أن هذا الأمر موضوع أهمية مشاركة المرأة في كافة المجالات، هذا هو ما يجب أن تكون عليه، وهذا هو الأصل، أن يتم السعي من خلال مختلف الأساليب ومثل هذا المنتدى. وأنا في لقائي مع الإخوة الوفد الأردني تحدثت أيضا عن تجربة لنا في الإمارات، وهي أنه لنا في الإمارات مجلس التوازن بين الجنسين، وترأس حرم سمو الشيخ منصور بن زايد، ونائبة الرئيس فيه منى المري اللي شاركتنا بالأمس في الجلسة الافتتاحية. ومن خلال هذا المجلس استطاعت الإمارات أن تطلع على كافة التشريعات وتعيد ما يحتاج إلى إعادة صياغة بحيث تمكن المرأة من المشاركة. النماذج اللي شاركتنا أيضا أمس في حضورها في حفل العشاء تأكيد على ما أنجزته المرأة في الإمارات. طبعا نحن يعني إذا ما قيست عمر الشعوب في الإمارات، نحن احتفلنا من قريب بالعيد 54 لقيام دولة الإمارات، ولكن هذا لا يعني أن المرأة في الإمارات بدأت من هذا التاريخ. المرأة في الإمارات تاريخها عريق في هذا، ولنا في والدة المرحوم الشيخ زايد الشيخة سلامة نموذج من النماذج اللي نعرفها في تاريخنا في الإمارات. مرة أخرى أنا أكرر الترحيب بكم، وأتمنى أنه أتيحت لكم الفرصة للاطلاع عن كثب وعن قرب على الإمارات والنماذج اللي التقيتوها بالأمس أيضا، بالذات في مجال موضوع مؤتمركم. وأتمنى أنكم أيضا تسمح ظروفكم بقضاء مزيد من الوقت في الإمارات، فنحن بنكون سعيدين باستمرار وجودكم معنا، بالذات في هذه الأيام. هذه الأيام الجو عندنا احنا بصراحة جو جميل، بعض دولكم الجو بارد، فنحن يعني سعيدين لو استمريتوا معنا وقضيتوا معنا في هذه الأيام الجميلة الوقت اللي تسمح فيه ظروفكم. مرة أخرى أنا شاكر لكم على كل الجهود وأتمنى لكم التوفيق، وحقيقة ما أنجز أمر مفرح، ونهنئكم على كل ما قمتم فيه. شكرا.
شكرا معالي الرئيس على هذه الكلمة، وبذلك نختتم أعمال الدورة الثانية لمنتدى النساء البرلمانيات، ونلتقيكم بإذن الله تعالى في الدورة الثالثة قريبا إن شاء الله. شكرا لكم.